Chapter 60, Interruptions. Florence appeared about midway through training. Savage had just started on the blood ward-focused part of his lecture, looking tired, and rather unwell. She was paler than usual, had a cut on her cheek and her arm was in a sling. She was immediately descended upon by Finch, and Ben hurried over to join them. Florence hugged him, and spotted Tonks. She waved, and Tonks waved back, and that was all they had time for before Finch ushered her back up the stairs. Presumably she had questions that needed answers. Tonks watched them leave, as guilt and worry gnawed on her insides, and tried to sort out what she was going to do. She was due to meet Mad Eye in less than 10 minutes, and she still have no idea what to say to him. It was her job to catch people that did the wrong thing, and Florence, technically, had, but Tonks didn't feel right just turning one of her best friends over to the ministry. "I'll say nothing," she decided. "Not for another day or two. Not until I can be sure that whatever decision I make is the right, or least wrong, one." Sirius' second trial was nowhere near as eventful as the first one. It happened 3 days after June's full moon, when Remus was entirely recovered, and it was a very quiet affair, with just Fudge, Amelia, Rattler and Umbridge there on the ministry's behalf, and only Sirius, Remus, and Harry there for their side. The whole thing took half an hour, at the end of which, Sirius had managed to argue Remus' way out of several prison terms and a fine. Umbridge's prejudice against werewolves was shining through, and Sirius thought he wanted to strangle the woman as much as Remus, who kept flexing his hands, and Sirius himself had given in with rather ill grace and let them issue him a large fine for being an illegal animagus. "I did technically break the law," he complained, as he, Remus and Harry made their way to level 2 so that he could register, "but you would think that my time in Azkaban would negate the need for a bloody fine." "It's not like you can't afford it," Harry chimed, and Sirius pulled a face at him. Harry pulled one back, and then pressed himself a little closer to Sirius' side and nervously tried to flatten his fringe. A witch had just entered their lift and promptly dropped the stack of papers she was holding. Sirius said, staring back at the woman just as intently as she was staring at them. It took her a moment to notice, and then she smiled nervously, and then she started to look uncomfortable. She got off on the next floor, and Sirius leaned against the side of the lift, feeling rather pleased with himself. "Git," Remus said, chuckling. "Hardly. She deserved it." Sirius grinned at Remus, who did his best to smother his very obvious smile, and at Harry, who looked amused enough for the moment, but also rather resigned. "But honestly," Sirius continued, "surely Azkaban makes up for." "If this is going to bother you that much," Remus said tiredly, "then go and challenge them about it." Sirius toyed with the idea for a few seconds and then shook his head. "It's not worth it," he sighed. Then he grinned at Harry and said, "I reckon we've caused enough trouble." "Probably," Harry agreed, laughing. Remus shook his head at the two of them, and stepped out of the lift. Sirius steered Harry out after him, and took the lead through the still familiar level 2. A few things had changed, but mostly, it was the same as it had been when Sirius worked as an Auror. Remus was intercepted by Dora, who was heading off to lunch and greeted them cheerfully, if a little warily, as they crossed the Auror section of the floor, and he left with a sheepish smile and a promise he'd be home in time for dinner. "He's oblivious," Sirius said, nudging Harry, as he smirked at Remus and Dora's backs. "To what?" Harry asked, waving tentatively at a pair of Aurors who had recognized him from guard duty. Sirius chuckled and then shook his head. "Never mind." Registering as an animagus was about as fun as Sirius had expected it to be. There was a form about 3 feet long, filled with stupid questions about Padfoot's appearance and personality, and he was relieved once it was done. "Guess the secret's officially out, isn't it, Prongs?" he thought wryly, and was well able to imagine James snorting and telling him it had been out since the first trial. He smiled to himself as he passed the completed form back to the scruffy witch at the desk, and gestured for Harry to follow. "Do you want to go flying tomorrow?" Sirius asked, as they headed back to the lift. Harry grinned. "Sounds brilliant," he said happily. Harry truly had inherited James' love of flying, but Sirius suspected some of his joy at the prospect was to get out of his animagus study. He had a tentative grasp on Latin, and so Sirius had helped him move to the next stage, which was trying to come up with an incantation that would allow him to transform. It was easily the most time-consuming part of the process. It wasn't easy to capture an entire personality and physical description in only a few sentences, and it was the part that Sirius expected Harry to struggle most with, purely because it required so much introspection. All he had managed to do so far was get frustrated. "At Moon." Someone cleared their throat behind Sirius, and he recognized the sound's owner and stiffened. "Harry," a voice said quietly. "Hello, sir," Harry said, with an easy smile and wave. Dumbledore smiled back, and then looked over at Sirius. Sirius' attempt at looking aloof vanished and was replaced by shock. Dumbledore looked nervous. "Sirius," he said carefully. "Afternoon," Sirius said, and didn't offer anything else. Dumbledore opened his mouth, as if he wanted to say something, and then he bowed his head, apparently thinking better of it. Sirius couldn't decide whether to feel relieved or disappointed. "Is Remus here with you?" Dumbledore asked finally, clasping his hands in front of him. "He was," Sirius said, folding his arms. "Why?" "I require a word with." "He's gone to get lunch," Sirius said. Harry glanced between Sirius and Dumbledore and looked a little disconcerted. Sirius sighed, realizing he probably looked like a bit of a prat glaring at his old headmaster, and unfolded his arms. He put a hand on Harry's shoulder instead, and Harry smiled, but still looked concerned. "No idea how long he'll be." Dumbledore looked disappointed, and Sirius felt something inside him shrivel. He still hated that look, and the way it made him feel. He groaned. "He'll be living in his cottage again as of tomorrow, though," Sirius said. "I don't know if that helps, but—" "It helps, dear boy," Dumbledore said, beaming. Sirius wasn't sure if he was happy to have an answer, or if he was happy that Sirius had offered the information. He thought it was the latter. Well, he hoped it was. And then he cursed himself for thinking that way, because he was still angry. Except he wasn't, he just thought he should be. "Sarah and Ethan, you said?" Remus asked, and Dumbledore nodded and passed him a cup of tea. Remus groaned, and kneaded his forehead. "You know them, I take it?" Dumbledore asked, stirring sugar into his own tea. "Sarah usually goes by a different name," Remus said. "Green Tooth." He sighed. "But yes, I know her. And Ethan too, I think." Based on Dumbledore's description, Ethan could only be Silver Ear. "They're from the camp." Dumbledore gave him a searching look and said, "I take it you and she are on rather poor terms." "Something like that," Remus sighed. "I found her a little troubling," Dumbledore admitted. "She's not at Tom Riddle's level, but I do have more reservations about her than I do about most of the other students. My main concern is that she could be dangerous." "Of course she's dangerous, she's a werewolf," Remus said, taking a sip of tea.
We're not exactly cuddly.
Dumbledore chuckled, but sobered quickly.
Usually, I would give her a chance without hesitation, the way I did for you, but due to her self-confessed affection for her father, I felt it would be wiser to ask for your opinion. I wish to help them, of course, but if they will prove dangerous to other students because of their upbringing.
Remus wasn't sure what to say. If what Dumbledore had said was true, then Greentooth and Silverear were coming to Hogwarts to try to give themselves a chance at a reasonably normal wizarding life. He didn't like them, but they were only children and deserved a chance to have a fresh start. Didn't they?
Give them a chance,
Remus sighed, after a moment of thought.
One chance.
He hoped, for their sakes, that they'd make the best of it.
Very well,
Dumbledore said. Remus relaxed a little.
Thank you for your insight.
Remus drained his cup and stood.
Actually,
Dumbledore said worriedly,
I was wondering if I might be able to have a bit your time. It's about Sirius. What about him?
Remus asked flatly, but Dumbledore shook his head.
He?
Dumbledore sighed.
Is he happy? Reasonably,
Remus said.
And safe? Him and Harry both? Yes, they're both safe,
Remus assured him. And then, because, while it had worked out for the best, he was still annoyed at Sirius for abandoning him to Dora after the moon, added,
they're living in Sirius' parents' old house, and the ward's on that. Yes, it is,
Dumbledore said, smiling.
I thought it might rain all through the summer. Pardon? I said. Yes, I heard that,
Remus said impatiently,
but it's a bit of a sudden conversation change. How so? Well, I said they're staying at Sirius' old house. Yes, and then I agreed and said it is indeed a nice day today. Don't you think that's a bit off topic? Dear boy, I agreed with you. I didn't say anything that needed to be agreed with. Pardon?
Dumbledore asked.
I told you where they were living and you told me about it raining in the summer. You told me the weather was nice today,
Dumbledore said, smiling faintly.
I didn't. I said they're living in Sirius' old house. You're contradicting yourself, Remus.
Remus sighed, frustrated.
They're living at Grimmauld Place. I am aware your owl is named Strix,
Dumbledore said, frowning slightly.
What does he have to do with Sirius or the weather, though? Why are we talking about my owl?
Remus asked, startled into laughter.
You brought it up,
Dumbledore said.
Sirius and Harry are living at number 12 Grimmauld Place,
Remus said, reasonably confident now that those words wouldn't come out, for some strange reason.
Yes, I suppose I can arrange to have biscuits brought up,
Dumbledore said.
Just give me a... biscuits.
Remus muttered.
I don't want biscuits. Then why did you ask?
Dumbledore said.
Sirius,
Remus said slowly,
is living at Nostril. Wait, what? Nostril? No,
Remus took a deep breath.
They're living at number Burr. Tweezers, no, sorry, toothpaste, no. Twilight, no. The number after elephant? No.
Dumbledore seemed to be enjoying himself.
Do you know, perhaps, whether there are any security charms on Sirius' home? Hundreds,
Remus said.
I suspect that's what this is, the Fidelius charm. If that doesn't answer your question about safety, I don't know what will.
Damn you, Padfoot, he thought, amused.
At the very least, we know they're well protected.
Then, looking wary again, Dumbledore said,
Tell me, Remus, is possible I could write them a letter? Of course, sir,
Remus said.
But maybe I could invite him here,
he offered. It was probably some sort of reconciliation that Dumbledore had in mind, and Sirius would be a hypocrite not to make an appearance, when he had forced Remus to do the same thing only a few days ago.
I think he and Harry were just hanging around the house today.
Dumbledore's beamed.
Feel free to use the fireplace.
Remus tossed a handful of Floo powder into Dumbledore's fireplace, knelt down and said,
Numbat Toucan, Garden Prosperity. It is a very good thing you're merely attempting to fire call and not travel. The delightful owners of Garden Prosperity would have been in for quite a surprise.
Dumbledore said.
Perhaps I should leave the room. Yes, please,
Remus said, red-faced.
Speak very, very clearly,
Padfoot said, looking nervous, and a bit annoyed. Remus had flued them a few minutes ago, said something about Dumbledore and something about Tonks and Padfoot being a hypocrite, and now apparently they were off to Hogwarts.
And you can go first, just in case.
Harry stepped into the green flames.
Headmaster's office, Hogwarts,
he said. The fire whooshed around him and he saw bricks rushing past his face and there was soot in his eyes and green, lots of green, and he hit his elbow again, and his glasses were slipping and then he skidded out onto soft carpet.
Hello, Harry,
Moony said, helping him up.
Hi,
Harry said.
Hello, Professor Dumbledore. Hello, Harry. Sirius is on his way,
Harry said, glancing around the large, circular room. There were bookshelves spreading around the walls of the office, and above and between those were portraits of witches and wizards. Harry crossed the room to inspect a table of strange, silver instruments, most of which were whirring quietly, or flashing, or emitting little puffs of smoke. He didn't dare touch them. Behind Dumbledore's desk was a ragged old hat that Harry thought looked like it should have been thrown out years ago. There was a large cabinet off to one side of the room, holding a strange-looking bowl, and a soft trilling noise made Harry look towards the office door. Sitting on a golden perch was what could only have been a phoenix. It was the size of a swan with bright, intelligent eyes and vivid red and gold feathers. It trilled again and Harry waved at it before retreating back across the room to stand by Moony, who was muttering to himself about gardens, gnomes, parrots and parades. Dumbledore was humming. A minute or so later, the fire flared green again and spat Padfoot out.
Ah,
he said, spotting Harry, you made it. Harry scowled good-naturedly.
Morning,
Padfoot said to Dumbledore and Moony.
Good morning, Sirius,
Dumbledore said.
How are you?
Fine, Padfoot said, shrugging. He glowered at Moony, who looked smug.
I hope I'm not disrupting any plans,
Dumbledore said, and Harry thought he almost sounded shy.
We were going to go for a walk,
Padfoot said, shrugging.
Have a game of fetch. Nothing we can't do later.
His voice was very polite.
As a dog?
Dumbledore asked, looking amused.
Sure,
Padfoot said.
None of us ever picked that,
Dumbledore murmured to himself.
Picked what?
Harry asked. Dumbledore turned to him, eyes twinkling.
I'm getting sidetracked, I'm afraid,
he said.
Thinking about Padfoot, actually, when the names came about, sometime in 3rd year, I believe.
Moony and Padfoot nodded.
The staff began taking bets on what the names were for. Did they really?
Moony exclaimed, laughing. Dumbledore inclined his head.
No wonder old Minnie was so insistent about trying to work it out,
Padfoot said, looking amused. The amount of tension in the room had lightened considerably.
She set our progress back weeks because we were so paranoid. She'd be delighted to hear it, I'm sure,
Dumbledore said, smiling.
The record of everyone's wagers adorned the staff room for quite some time, though I haven't the faintest clue where it's ended up. 5 galleons on Minnie,
Padfoot said, grinning. Then he seemed to recover his strange mood and sobered. Moony glanced between them, caught Harry's eye and then nodded at the office door. Harry nodded and the pair of them excused themselves.
Best to let them sort things out on their own,
Moony said, leading Harry down a staircase. They found themselves in a corridor. One girl in blue robes walked past and gave them curious looks, thought thankfully didn't look close enough to recognize Harry, sitting on a stone bench beside a large window that overlooked the Hogwarts grounds. Harry was going to miss Padfoot and Moony and Creature when he moved to Hogwarts next year, but it certainly seemed like a nice place to live, especially when it was lit up by the summer sun.
See that tree?
Moony asked.
That's the Whomping Willow,
a snide voice finished. Harry stifled a groan and Moony squeezed his eyes shut.
Snape,
they said together.
Potter. Lupin.
Snape glanced around, apparently trying to spot Padfoot.
He's in Dumbledore's office,
Moony said. It seemed he had reached the same conclusion as Harry.
Of course,
Snape drawled, looking annoyed.
Black always did have the very worst timing.
Snape cast a quick charm to check the time and then scowled and snapped a word at a statue by the wall Harry and Remus had come through earlier. Moony and Harry talked, with Moony pointing out features of the grounds, for a while longer, at least until raised voices drifted down from the office. Moony groaned and got to his feet. He didn't invite Harry, but he didn't tell him to stay either, so Harry went with him. Moony pushed open the office door to reveal Padfoot and Snape glaring at each other, from a few yards away, and Dumbledore getting to his feet, looking impatient.
Suspect, Black, it has something to do with a botched murder attempt plot.
Harry waited, hardly daring to breathe. Moony had also gone very still beside him, and Dumbledore was watching with a guarded expression.
James saved you and you know it.
Padfoot snapped. He didn't deny it, Harry realized, feeling ill. He did try to kill him. Snape was telling the truth.
Only to defend you, Black.
Snape spat.
A position his offspring has graciously filled. Don't bring Harry into this.
Padfoot shouted, getting to his feet.
Serious?
Moony said, trying to get Padfoot to sit down.
You brought Potter into this when you kidnapped him, Black, so don't you tell me. They treated him like you treated Lily.
Padfoot said.
Like dirt. Like something beneath them. Professor,
Harry said, trying to get Dumbledore's attention. Snape looked dangerous. He knew how much Padfoot and Snape disliked each other, but for this to have accelerated this quickly. Harry shivered and one of the trinkets on Dumbledore's desk exploded.
Father,
Snape was saying.
I do not keep him around so that I can pretend he's James.
Padfoot roared, startling Moony. He waved his wand and Snape's greasy hair turned a vivid pink. Snape snarled and Padfoot sprouted a nasty set of boils on his forehead. Moony was still trying to get himself between them and Dumbledore was trying to calm them down verbally. Harry, who might ordinarily have found this funny, was close to losing it. Snape, the git, had hexed his godfather, said awful things about both of Harry's parents and been rude to Harry himself. Padfoot, the bigger git, had started it. Harry had defended Padfoot, said he wasn't a murderer, and was rewarded with finding out his godfather had actually tried to kill Snape, and then this bout of infantile dueling. Harry found his magic and flung it out with the intention of getting them both to be quiet. Both were shoved into seats and their voices immediately cut off.
Harry,
Moony said, releasing Padfoot's arm, to put a hand on Harry's shoulder.
Don't,
Harry said shortly, pulling out of the other man's grip. He just knew he wanted to get out of there, to get home, and so he spun on the spot, his magic lashing out around him, pinning Padfoot again when he tried to get up. Severus stared at the place where the Potter boy had vanished. Several of the silver instruments Dumbledore insisted on keeping were going wild. One was flashing brightly when usually it just pulsed dimly, one, that somewhat resembled a Muggle spinning top, was whizzing around and the one that had kept exploding was still broken, resting in numerous pieces on the table and carpet. Dumbledore got up, tapped the spinning one once to still it, repaired the emotional gauge one with a warning look at Severus and Black, as if they might break it again, and picked up the flashing one, murmuring in a strange tongue Severus didn't understand.
Fascinating,
he murmured, setting it down again. Black seemed to snap out of his stupor. He waved his hands at Lupin, who tapped his shoulder with his wand.
I have to go,
Black said urgently.
You'll stay right where you are,
Dumbledore said firmly.
And if you say another word before I ask you to speak again, I'll silence you myself. That goes for you too, Severus.
Severus abandoned all hope of getting out unscathed when he heard the disappointment in the headmaster's voice. He nodded, well aware he'd make a fool of himself if he tried to speak. The Potter brat's silencing charm was no doubt still affecting him. Dumbledore was now walking around his desk with his wand raised above his head as he muttered various protective enchantments.
Sir,
Lupin said, puzzled.
It would seem,
Dumbledore said, still walking in his circle,
that your behavior cost Harry enough distress that he was able to remove a section of the wards in his desperation to return home.
Severus' mouth fell open.
That's not possible,
Lupin exclaimed.
Oh, I assure you it is,
Dumbledore said. He sounded cheerful enough but his eyes were not twinkling even slightly. Typical Potter, no regard for school property. Never mind, those wards are in place to protect the students and staff. As soon as they're inconvenient, he just brushes them aside and does what he pleases. Dumbledore didn't seem to mind. He wasn't angry with Potter, anyway, though he did seem annoyed at Black and at Severus. Worse was that Severus felt he might deserve it. But only a bit. And Black deserved it more than he did. The boy was Black's to care for, not to upset and send into a fit of magical distress.
He's 9.
Black said, looking confused, proud and worried all at once.
And in considerable distress,
Dumbledore said in a steely tone.
He could not do it if he tried, and I doubt that he could ever repeat it, but it has happened nonetheless. Alas, accidental magic is often this way, unpredictable, and devastatingly powerful if given half a chance.
Potter was by no means as strong magically as Dumbledore, but he was still young and he was certainly no average wizard, if Draco's stories were to be believed. If he could learn to control that power, the Dark Lord would have a valid reason to fear him after all. The boy had just vanished, after all. Had he had a portkey Severus hadn't been aware of? Or perhaps he had apparated somehow. That should be impossible, given his age and all of the laws of magic that said one could not apparate inside the castle, but if he had torn down the wards then perhaps not. Curious, Severus sent a very light legilimency probe in Black's direction. It should have merely schemed the forefront of his mind and perhaps enlightened Severus on whatever it was that had just happened, but something else occurred instead. The probe was thrust back, and knocked into the walls of Severus' dungeon mind with a mental thud that made him wince. What in Merlin's?
Do you mind?
Black snarled, without as much as a grimace. Dumbledore and Lupin looked between them, confused. Severus merely raised a hand to his temple and scowled at Black, who, it seemed, had just blocked him, without even seeming bothered. The man was still staring at the place where Potter had disappeared.
Serious? No, sir,
Black snapped.
I'm not a student here anymore, and sure, I'm younger than you are, but I don't have any obligation to listen to you if I don't want to. I'm a free man. I'm sorry for what I said today.
Black shifted, looking genuinely apologetic.
And I'd be more than happy to try to patch up your hurt feelings later.
His eyes landed on Severus at this last.
But if you think that's coming before Harry, you're dead wrong, because at the moment, the person that deserves an apology from me the most isn't here, and I rather think that I need to be where he is.
Severus made a small, disgusted noise, one meant to goad Black a bit, but Black just gave him a look containing equal parts loathing of Severus, and also of himself.
I'm amiable to giving you a second chance,
Black said stiffly, looking at Dumbledore.
You'll have to work for it, but the opportunity is there.
Dumbledore, oddly, looked pleased, as if Black's opinion of him mattered.
If you need to contact me, send a letter to Remus and he'll make sure I get it.
Black and Lupin exchanged a thoughtful look, and then Lupin nodded.
I've got to go. I'll see you tomorrow, Moony.
Lupin nodded.
Come around whenever. And SNA.
Black swallowed loudly, as if utterly repulsed by something.
Severus.
He finally managed. Dumbledore didn't seem to notice the subtle inflection on the final few syllables, but Lupin did and sighed.
Black. I'm sorry,
he said, looking as if he were physically in pain.
I don't take back anything I did today.
Lupin groaned quietly, massaging his temples.
But if I could do this afternoon over, then maybe I'd have been less enthusiastic with the insults.
Severus merely stared at him, wishing he had the ability to cause people, severe pain, with just his eyes. Black nodded once and walked over to the fire. He whispered an address that Severus didn't hear, and didn't need to hear, and was gone. Lupin made his excuses and left shortly after, leaving Severus alone with Dumbledore.
I have essays to mark,
he said, heading for the door.
Not so quickly, Severus,
the headmaster said, nodding at the 3 seats in front of him. Severus sighed and dropped into the one the Potter boy had used. His skin crawled at the very idea, but he'd rather sit where the Potter boy had than where Lupin or Black had.
Say what you need to, then,
Severus said bluntly.
I'm short on time and my patience has long since expired. I had expected more from you. I was provoked,
Severus replied.
I appreciate that,
Dumbledore said,
but you were hardly a guiltless party. You are a grown man. As is Black,
Severus said, folding his arms. He refused to feel guilty about what had just transpired.
Harry Potter is only a boy, and even he thought your behavior was inept. Harry Potter is the most spoiled, inconsiderate. You are determined to hate him, Severus,
Dumbledore said gently,
for no reason other than that he exists. No reason?
Severus repeated.
You of all people should understand, Headmaster, that there is no greater reason. Not for you,
Dumbledore sighed.
Remember, though, Severus, that Lily Potter sacrificed her life for her son. She believed that there was something in him, that he would be capable of great. The fact remains, Headmaster, that she died for him,
Severus said curtly.
And that is unforgivable.
He spun on his heel and strode out of the office, relieved Dumbledore did not try to call him back. It was with a heavy heart that she said her goodbyes to Yaxley and trudged up to Mad-Eye's office. She bit her lip, trying to think of the best way to present her suspicions to her mentor, and knocked.
I'm busy.
Mad-Eye growled. Tonks let herself in anyway, and Mad-Eye spun in his chair. She cringed, his eye was out and resting in a glass of water on his desk.
That's disgusting,
she said, looking away.
Well, good,
he said, ignoring her comment.
You were the person I was about to be busy with. I think I might have found our killer.
Tonks shrugged her rucksack off and left it in the corner.
You have?
Tonks asked, both afraid that Mad-Eye had reached the same conclusion as she had, and hopeful that it might be someone else.
Island Lovegood,
he said, and Tonks blinked. I was wrong? She wondered, feeling hopeful, but also confused. It made sense, though. All the times she's been sick, or slept in. Though I suppose not all of them were on full moons, last week wasn't a full moon, after all. Maybe she's just incredibly unlucky. Maybe she was really kidnapped last night. Maybe she didn't attack herself, maybe she got hurt fighting her way free. She had been sure, almost certain, in fact, but Mad-Eye had been at this job a lot longer than she had, and he knew a likely suspect when he saw one. And it's this Lovegood woman, apparently. Not Florence. She relaxed a little, and shook her head. Silly. Of course it couldn't be Florence. Florence is so small and fragile. She couldn't be a wolf. And surely someone would have noticed by now. The Aura department isn't perfect, but surely they'd have done background checks or something before they let us in. She nodded to herself, and accepted Lovegood's file from Mad-Eye.
Read it,
he said, trying to fish his eye out of his glass.
Then tell me what you think.
Tonks pulled a chair over and sat down, her eyes already scheming over the parchment. By the time she finished reading, she had convinced herself that it was definitely Lovegood.
She designs spells?
Tonks asked, arching an eyebrow.
She does. And, if that wasn't enough, she's got a vague connection to Greyback. What?
Tonks flicked through the file again, but found nothing about that.
Her husband self-publishes a magazine. It's about all sorts of things, but they've got an underlying focus on magical creatures. They've had stories about werewolves a few times in the last few years, and the articles are all detailed enough for me to be confident that someone, maybe Lupin Smokey, is answering questions. So Lovegood's not Smokey?
Tonks asked, her heart sinking again.
Let's find out,
he said, hauling himself out of his chair. 2 hours, 2 flights, 3 flu excursions, 1 Muggle bus and 4 port keys later, Tonks had finally managed to convince Mad-Eye that no one was following them, and they arrived on the Lovegood's front doorstep. Mad Eye instantly began casting spells, while Tonks had a look around. The house was large, black, and cylindrical, and Tonks stared, fascinated at it, and also at the eccentric combination of plants growing in the garden. She was surprised that, despite her high marks in NEWT herbology, she only recognized one or two things.
Have you ever seen anything like that before?
She asked, nudging Mad Eye. Her ignored her and didn't even look in the direction of the plant with orange radish-like fruit. Instead, he continued to cast charms that were probably giving him all sorts of information about the house and its occupants. Unnecessary information, Tonks thought, knowing her mentor wouldn't go anywhere without a good idea of what he was getting himself into. He was just being paranoid again, and she suspected he'd spend another hour doing this if she let him. Rolling her eyes at the thought, Tonks stepped forward and knocked on the door.
Nymphadora!
Mad Eye snarled, freezing in place. Tonks heard voices in the house, and then light footsteps. Mad Eye's mouth set in a grim line, and he snatched his sidekick out of a pocket in his robes. Tonks followed his example, though felt she was more relaxed about it. Mad Eye's knuckles were white, and his sidekick was in danger of being crushed. Her own was clasped loosely in her hand, and she traced the letters of her name with her thumbnail. Tonks saw Mad Eye square his shoulders out of the corner of her eye, and a moment later, the door opened to reveal a small, brightly colored figure, holding a paintbrush. Tonks liked the girl on first sight, which was a bit of a shame, since they were here to question her mother. She was wearing a pair of large, fluffy boots, vibrant green jeans and a bubblegum pink smock that was liberally splattered in colorful paint. The girl's eyes trailed over both of them. She seemed more curious than taken aback by Mad Eye's eye, and then she tucked her paintbrush behind her ear and smiled at them.
Hello,
she said, in a high-pitched, rather dreamy voice.
Morning,
Mad Eye said gruffly.
I'm Aura Moody, this is trainee Tonks. Can I see that?
The girl asked, looking at the sidekicks with big eyes.
Sure,
Tonks said, dropping hers into the girl's small hands. She realized too late that she probably should have offered to clean the girl's hands first. They were covered in smears of paint too, and did her best to ignore Mad Eye, who was looking at her as if she had just done something inexcusable. The girl held Tonks' sidekick up for close inspection and then sniffed it.
Interesting,
she said, squinting at Tonks, who gave her a blank look.
I thought it might have been made of leprechaun gold. No,
Tonks said, accepting her sidekick back. She wiped it on her robes and managed to get most of the paint off before she returned it to her pocket. Then, curious, she added,
why would it be made of leprechaun gold? Oh, it's not, I just thought it might be. Perhaps you haven't heard, she said, looking thoughtful. Rufus Scrimgeour's part leprechaun, so. Is your mother home?
Mad Eye asked, clearing his throat. Tonks bit the inside of her cheek and rearranged her face slightly to keep from laughing.
Yes,
the girl said, staring at them both again.
Would you like to see her?
Yes please, Tonks said, and, after a glance at Mad Eye, entered the house. End of chapter. Chapter 61, The Loss of Padfoot's Pride. Sirius strode out of the fireplace as soon as Grimald's kitchen materialized and only paused long enough to take in the abandoned frying pan on the stove, creatured obviously left in a hurry, before he sprinted up the stairs, skidded on the floorboards, and launched himself up the main staircase as Padfoot. He cut his paws on glass, from shattered lamps, on the way up, but the thing that bothered him most about that was the implication that Harry's magic had still been lashing out when he arrived home, instead of exhausted by tearing down the wards at Hogwarts. Things got noisier, the higher up Sirius went, and the reason became apparent when he managed to distinguish his mother's shrill voice. Harry had obviously disrupted the portraits. Sure enough, they were lying in a pile on the floor of Creature's cupboard, cursing that Potter brat. Creature himself was there too, and Padfoot retransformed into Sirius at the sight of him. The old elf was alternating between hitting his head against the wall, and staring worriedly at Harry's closed door.
Creature was told not to worry,
Creature croaked, rather pitifully.
But Creature worries, oh yes. The brat is not fine, oh no, even if he says he is, but Creature was told to stay out, oh yes, and Creature listens. I'll take care of it,
Sirius promised, and then was hit with the niggling doubt that he might not be able to, this time. This wasn't a self-confidence issue of Harry's, or something that needed explaining. This was Sirius' fault. He should have waited until Harry wasn't around before he started having a proper discussion with Dumbledore about their fallout after the trial, and he shouldn't have let Snape provoke him as much as he had, and Hermione certainly shouldn't have retaliated. Lily would have hexed me for behaving the way I did today, he thought dejectedly. And Prongs too. Moony would have, I'm sure, but then he'd have looked just as bad as I did.
Harry,
he called, rapping on the door.
Can I come in?
There was no response.
Harry? Kiddo?
Still nothing.
Harry,
Sirius said,
if you don't want to talk, that's fine, but could you just let me know that you're all right?
Sirius fidgeted.
Harry? Kiddo, I'm coming in.
When that didn't win him even a protest in response, Sirius tried the doorknob, and was surprised to find the door was unlocked. It swung open. It was not as messy as he had expected. There were clothes on the floor, but they looked like they had been dropped there, not thrown around by accidental magic. The desk was always untidy, and clearly not affected by magic either. Harry's bed was unmade, but he never did that anyway, and Harry himself was draped rather precariously on the end, unmoving.
Harry,
Sirius said, stepping forward. Harry didn't even twitch. Sirius swore under his breath and approached the bed. Harry was indeed unconscious. He was very pale, rather clammy, and also bleeding from a serious, but not life-threatening cut on his lower neck. Splinching, Sirius thought with a grimace. He scooped Harry up and rearranged him on the bed properly. He had to pluck his godson's wand out of his tightly clenched fist after almost poking himself in the eye, and then fixed the cut and cleaned the blood away with a few waves of his wand. A few diagnostics convinced him that there was nothing truly wrong with Harry, other than being exhausted. He set up a charm to tell him when Harry's feet touched the floor, a charm he had found in that parenting book Remus had given him for Christmas, and left the room. Creature was still waiting out on the landing.
He's asleep,
Sirius said, in a voice that sounded hollow even to his own ears.
Wake the brat,
Creature suggested, with an uncommonly shrewd look. Sirius shifted and glanced at Harry's door. Then he shook his head, without meeting Creature's eyes. Creature harumphed and pointed at the stairs.
Creature will make tea,
he decided. Sirius didn't argue. He shuffled downstairs, and felt even guiltier than he had already when Creature refused to let him repair any of the damage Harry had made. 3 hours, 7 cups of tea and one conclusion, that Remus must have gone home or stayed at Hogwarts because he still hadn't shown up. Later, Sirius jumped as his wand vibrated. Harry was out of bed. Sirius drained the rest of his tea and got up. Creature glanced at him and then turned back to the chopping board, feeling nervous, and also incredibly embarrassed and ashamed of. Because of Snape? Sirius asked himself, as he trudged upstairs. Or because of how I acted? He still hadn't decided by the time he reached Harry's door, which was still closed, and knocked.
Harry.
There was no response, but this time, Sirius was sure it was because Harry was ignoring him.
"Kiddo, can I come in? If I say no, will you do it anyway?"
Harry asked. There was more bite than humor in his voice, and Sirius flinched.
"No,"
he said, after a pause. There was silence, as Harry mulled that over, and then a huff.
"All right,"
Harry said, and Sirius stepped into the room. Harry was curled up in his desk chair, staring out of the window with a distant expression on his young face and his wand held tightly in his fist. Sirius lifted his wand to conjure himself a chair and then thought better of it. He remained on his feet.
"Thanks for fixing my neck,"
Harry said, without looking at him. Sirius waved his hand dismissively.
"Do you feel okay?" "Tired,"
was all Harry offered.
"Can I talk to you?" "You already are,"
Harry replied, still not looking at him.
"I'm sorry,"
Sirius said.
"I don't want an apology,"
Harry told him, spinning his chair around.
"That's too bad,"
Sirius said.
"You're getting one anyway." "But you didn't do anything to me,"
Harry mumbled, looking at him properly for the first time. Sirius rolled his eyes, but he was sad to see just how guarded Harry's face was. He was clearly trying to look composed, but he was failing miserably. Every few seconds he'd clench his jaw, as if to remind himself that he was angry, and he couldn't hide the look of disappointment that kept flickering through his brilliant green eyes.
"I upset you,"
he said. Harry shrugged, trying to look indifferent.
"I'm sorry for being such a git to Snape." "I don't care about that,"
Harry said. Sirius raised an eyebrow.
"Well, a bit, but not much. He deserves it." "It's still no excuse,"
Sirius said, now a little thrown. What exactly had he done to upset his godson? He waited. Harry swallowed noisily, shifted his wand from his left hand to his right and squared his jaw. His eyes, which had more or less been avoiding Sirius until now, flicked up to watch his face.
"Did you really try to kill Snape?"
he asked, getting straight to the point as Sirius had hoped he would. "Ah." Sirius took a deep breath. Harry watched him critically, and moved his wand almost imperceptibly so that it was pointed at Sirius. "He's afraid of me," he realized. With that thought came shame, and it burned.
"Don't lie,"
Harry said.
"Please."
Sirius nodded slowly, and sat down on the end of Harry's bed.
"It was an accident." "So you did." "I didn't mean to,"
Sirius said, letting out a noisy breath.
"It was a full moon. James and Peter were waiting for me in the dormitory, and then all three of us were going to go down to keep Remus company. Snape was..."
"Snape?" Harry's eyes narrowed slightly.
"I'm not trying to defend myself, I promise. I'm just trying to put things into perspective. Snape had been following us all around, trying to get us expelled, Merlin knows why, and usually it wasn't a problem, but since I had to get back to the others and we all had to get down to Moony, my patience was running fairly thin. Snape was making some uncannily accurate guesses about where Moony was, and I got more and more frustrated before I finally told him how to get past the Whomping Willow. I honestly didn't mean to. I was angry and it slipped out and I couldn't take it back."
He smiled without humor.
"You sent Snape down to where a live werewolf was?"
Harry asked.
"Look, I was young, I was stupid, and I wanted Snape to bugger off and leave me the hell alone. I wasn't thinking at all."
Harry didn't contradict him. Sirius didn't expect him to.
"Of course, the first thing I did was try to obliviate the git. The second thing I did was tell James." Bet he thought it was funny,
Harry muttered.
Funny? Not at all.
Harry looked bewildered and hopeful.
He went down after Snape. He saved his life.
There was more to it, of course, but the rest wasn't exactly relevant.
And you just sat by?
Harry asked, a little angrily.
Of course not. That was Peter's job. He sat on his bed and did his homework. No, I went and told McGonagall what I had done, and then I went down to help James Carey snivel us out. He fainted when he heard me coming.
Oh, Harry said.
Oh.
Sirius repeated, amused despite himself. Harry flushed, but he lowered his wand slightly.
So it was an accident? Didn't I already say that?
Harry bit his lip.
What was my dad really like? What do you mean, what was he really? Was he obnoxious?
Harry blurted, looking pained.
Snape said he was capable of murder at the age of 16. Never,
Sirius said firmly.
Obnoxious, perhaps, we all were, really. Capable of murder? Absolutely not. He didn't want Snape dead. Weren't you listening before? James saved Snape. And I told him how to get down there, sure, but I didn't actually want him to get hurt. I'm a kiddo, but I'm not a monster.
Harry's face brightened a bit, and Sirius wondered what part it was that had reassured him. A moment later, though, Harry was looking frustrated.
Why does he hate him so much?
Harry asked, frustrated.
Who? Snape, and Dad. It's just one of those things, kiddo. Jealousy was a big part of it. James was a Quidditch player, either chaser or seeker, and brilliant at both. He was smart, popular, everyone liked him. Snape was an oddball. Lily was his only friend, and even she stopped trying after 5th year. He said some things, and he was too interested in the dark arts for her to be able to forgive him. I won't lie and say James and I didn't give the kid a hard time, but he wasn't the type to sit there and take it. We got as good as we gave, I assure you.
Harry didn't seem to know whether to be comforted by that or not. After a short while, his eyes grew distant again and he lost himself in his own thoughts. Sirius waited patiently, ready to answer any other questions he might have, but none came. It's hard to remember that he's not even 10 yet, he thought, sighing quietly. Harry was almost independent, and very mature in the way he spoke and carried himself.
Padfoot.
Still using nicknames, he thought, relieved. That's a good sign.
Yeah. You still have boils on your face. I know.
They were awfully itchy too, but they could wait.
Padfoot,
Harry said again.
Yeah. Sorry for leaving so suddenly, before. At Hogwarts.
Harry nodded. He rolled his eyes.
Kiddo, that's not something to apologize for. We've already established I was being a prat. It's my fault for making you leave. Although. Yes. Next time you see him, you should probably apologize to Dumbledore for ruining his wards. I didn't mean to,
Harry mumbled.
No one blames you,
Sirius assured him.
It's just the polite thing to do.
Harry nodded.
So,
Sirius said tentatively,
are we all right?
Harry looked him over appraisingly and nodded.
This is Mum,
the girl said, leading them into the kitchen. A woman, presumably Aileen, glanced over her shoulder as they walked in. She was standing with one foot on the kitchen bench, and the other on the back of a spindly chair. Tonks expected her to fall at any moment, but she looked perfectly comfortable.
"Hello,"
she said in a voice just as airy as her daughter's. She added a few more yellow splotches to the dragon she was painting on the kitchen cabinets and then tucked her paintbrush behind her ear, and Tonks now knew where the daughter had learned that particular behavior.
"I'm Aura Moody,"
Mad Eye said gruffly, flashing his badge at her. Tonks mimicked him.
"This is Trainee Tonks. We have a few questions for you."
Aileen climbed down. Tonks knew if she had been the one climbing, she'd have fallen and broken something, but Aileen managed with all of the ease of practice, wiped her hands on her flowery jeans and glanced curiously at Mad Eye's sidekick.
"Interesting,"
she said, peering at it. Mad Eye's mouth set, and Tonks just knew he was getting annoyed.
"That's not made out of leprechaun gold, is it?" "No, Mummy,"
the girl said.
"I checked."
She and her mother shared a smile that made Tonks think they were in on a rather enormous secret, a secret she and Mad Eye were excluded from. She glanced at Mad Eye, who was looking just as confused by the day's events as Tonks.
"Raxpert's bothering you?"
Aileen asked seriously. Tonks and Mad Eye shared another confused look, and Aileen swiped the air around them.
"The kitchen's full of them, I'm afraid. They like the smell of paint. Here, we'll talk in my study. Would you mind putting the kettle on, Luna, my love?"
Luna nodded and went straight to a cupboard and pulled out the strangest kettle Tonks had ever seen. It looked a bit like a jellyfish. She and Mad Eye had time for one confused look before they were led into another room, lined with bookshelves. A large, intricately carved desk took up the majority of the space. Tonks noticed several large scorch marks on the wood surface, and most of the floor space was taken up by bizarre-looking instruments that reminded Tonks of Dumbledore's office. These were wooden, however, not silver.
"Have a seat, please,"
Aileen said, gesturing to a pair of mismatched chairs. One was a large, squishy armchair, and the other was some sort of bar stool. Aileen noticed her looking at them and added,
"I find a different seat can be more conductive to my research,"
she explained, sitting down in a normal desk chair on the far side of the desk. Tonks was beginning to feel confused enough about all of this that she actually waited for Mad Eye to cast his charms before she sat.
"What do you know about Fenrir Greyback?"
Mad Eye asked.
"Ooh, lots,"
Aileen said, looking impressed with the turn the conversation had taken.
"He's, or he was, Europe's most notorious werewolf. Did you know that a werewolf can smell if you're happy or sad, the way a cat or dog can, even when they're human?" "We did, yes,"
Mad Eye told her.
"It would be incredibly useful, don't you think?"
she continued, looking thoughtful.
"My husband published an article in his magazine about it, but we reached the conclusion that the advantages of the heightened senses might not be worth the pain of transformation. Still, you've got to wonder, don't you?" "I suppose,"
Tonks said, when Mad Eye didn't say anything.
"Sorry,"
Aileen said, scratching a spot of paint off her wrist. She swatted at the air, like she had in the kitchen.
"Stray Raxpert. This room's mostly warded against them, but occasionally one will sneak through on a host."
She looked at Mad Eye.
"I think this one was yours. Do you feel any different than you did a few moments ago?" "Stay on topic, please, Lovegood,"
Mad Eye said, and Tonks suspected if he had answered her earlier question that the answer might not have been appropriate for polite conversation.
"Oh, Greyback?"
Aileen said.
"Of course, sorry. Well, I think he's a rather nasty piece of work, and I must say it's probably a good thing he's gone." "You're happy he's dead?" Happy's a strong word,
she said, shaking her blonde head.
I think excited is a better word. He had made such an enormous mess of everything here. The poor man started off promoting equality, which is, in my opinion, a rather admirable cause, but he got lost somewhere along the way. Very easy to do, unfortunately, and he hurt a lot of people. He can have a fresh start in death, and so can the people he's hurt. In life, in their case.
She added.
And you make spells for a living?
Mad Eye asked.
I do,
Aileen said, looking curious.
Dangerous work, that,
Mad Eye said.
Oh, it can be, I suppose,
she said,
but someone's got to do it, and I enjoy it. Charms. Charms?
Mad Eye asked.
I've always been rather useless at transfiguration,
she confided, looking a little put out.
It's a shame, really, because it means I have to find all sorts of other, far more complicated ways around things that should be simple, but I've just never been good with change.
Tonks and Mad Eye shared a long look.
Mrs. Lovegood, your husband's articles are very detailed,
Tonks said, glancing at Mad Eye, who gestured for her to ask away.
We were wondering where you got your information from. It's well researched, I'll have you know,
she said, a little coolly.
All of Xenophilius' work is. That's what we mean,
Tonks said hastily.
It's obvious you've got an inside source, maybe one of Greyback's victims. Perhaps,
Aileen said, smiling suddenly, but she looked disappointed a moment later.
I can't give you a name, I'm afraid. Our source is absolutely fascinating from a research perspective, and lovely from a conversational one. We have some questions for her,
Mad Eye said. Aileen looked troubled and then shook her head.
I can't help you, I'm afraid. This is an official investigation. And I'm required to answer your questions truthfully, which I've done,
she said serenely.
I can't and won't give up my source.
She clasped her hands, looking decisive, but genuinely sorry.
I'm sorry to be obstructive. If you have any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them, but otherwise, I have a kitchen to get back to.
There was a soft knock on the door and Tonks turned and spied Luna, who was carrying a tray laden with steaming mugs.
Would you like your tea before you go?
She asked. Tonks sniffed. The tea was a bright blue, which was concerning, and wrinkled her nose. Her sense of smell wasn't as good as Remus, but it was good enough to know when something smelled like it definitely shouldn't be ingested. She said, glancing at Mad Eye, who seemed to have reached the same conclusion.
No, we've got other places to be,
he said.
Thank you for the talk. Not a problem,
Aileen said, taking a sip from her cup.
Good luck with your investigation.
Luna showed them out and gave them a cheery wave before disappearing back inside. Tonks turned to Mad Eye.
Interesting, wasn't it?
She asked mildly. Mad Eye snorted and waved his wand.
What? It'll let me know if she sends any letters, and who they're to,
Mad Eye said.
So you don't think it was her?
Tonks asked.
Do you?
Mad Eye asked, and she shook her head.
Good. You've got the instincts.
Tonks beamed, but she was starting to feel ill again. If it wasn't Aileen, she had some idea who their murderer might be, and she didn't like the idea any more than she had that morning.
Padfoot.
Sirius jerked awake when he felt a hand on his shoulder.
For Merlin's sake, creature!
He groaned.
We've talked. It's Harry,
Harry said. The small, dark shape standing beside his bed shifted.
Harry, it's the middle of the night. I know. I just... Sorry.
Sirius sat up with a sigh and rubbed his eyes.
What's bothering you?
Harry was quiet for a long time. Sirius yawned and patted the bed beside him, and Harry accepted the invitation and sat.
Are you feeling all right? Does your neck? It's fine. Bad dream?
Sirius asked, smothering another yawn.
Do you think of me as my mum or dad?
He blurted. Sirius squinted at him, but it was too dark to make out Harry's expression. He considered lighting his wand, but he suspected he'd just end up blinding them both. Instead, he sniffed, and was disconcerted to find that Harry smelled worried, and also a little guilty.
What makes you think that?
He asked finally.
Something Snape,
Sirius groaned before he could even finish, and Harry bristled.
Kiddo, no,
he said.
I won't lie and say that you don't remind me of them from time to time. But no. More often than not, I look at you and I see the differences. You only have to look at your form to know you're not a copy of James, and Lily's wand doesn't work for you anywhere near as well as Prong's did. You're always saying that I'm like them, though.
Sirius smiled a touch sadly. It was only to himself, and maybe to James and Lily if they were somehow watching, because there was no way Harry would be able to see it.
You are, and that's probably the highest praise I can give you. So I'm like them, but not?
Harry asked, shifting beside him.
Pretty much,
Sirius said.
You were young enough when I took you from the Dursleys that I had to be the responsible one.
He smiled wryly, and when he realized Harry couldn't see that, he snorted. Harry smelled amused.
That in itself is a huge difference, because I was always the one that needed them to look after me.
Harry was silent.
At the risk of sounding like a complete sap,
Sirius added, glad that it was Harry and not James he was having this conversation with.
You have your similarities, like I said, particularly in the way you look, but if you were enough like them that I could mistake you for them, either of them, in some shape or way, then I wouldn't miss them as much as I do.
Harry lapsed into a thoughtful sort of silence after that, but fell asleep before he could actually voice whatever conclusion he had reached. Sirius chuckled, tucked some of the extra covers around him, and rolled onto his side, hoping to go back to sleep, but no such luck. The thoughts bouncing around in his head were too noisy to ignore. Sirius took a deep breath and knocked once, gently, on the dark wood of Snape's office door. He rocked back onto his heels, waiting, and when no one answered it for almost a minute, he knocked again.
Yes,
he heard, as the door was yanked open. Snape's dark eyes flicked up to his face, and Sirius only had time to open his mouth before the door slammed shut, narrowly missing his nose.
Snape!
He called. He heard footsteps stomping away from the door, and growled under his breath.
Snape!
He knocked again, and then paused in to listen. The office had fallen silent. Sirius sighed and crossed to the other side of the corridor, where he folded his arms and leaned against the cold, damp dungeon wall.
I'd like to talk if you've got a moment,
Sirius said loudly, but was met with no reply.
I'd like to apologize.
The door opened and Snape's glowering face appeared in the gap. Sirius immediately held up his hands to show he wasn't holding a wand.
Do get on with it, then,
he sneered. It was a tone that usually got a rise out of Sirius, but not today. He took a deep breath and gave the other man an unimpressed look. For a moment, Snape seemed to be at a loss.
Some of us have important things to do today.
I'm sorry, Sirius said, sincerely, and wondered what James would think of him if he could see this. The fact that he didn't know what James' response would be, was more daunting than the task itself. He swallowed, and wiped his hands on his robes.
We were kids, when this started.
He gestured between them.
And kids can be stupid. Teenagers too, but they should know better. Adults definitely should. The point, Black. The point, Snape,
Sirius sighed,
is that this stupid grudge has been going on since we were 11. House prejudices turned into hexing and insults and me almost getting you killed because I wasn't thinking, and you not helping me when you knew where Peter was. I knew nothing of the kin. Harry overheard you talking to my cousin. You knew.
Sirius said. Snape's face was unreadable.
I'm saying I'm done,
Sirius said.
I'm sorry, and... Done? Sorry.
Snape drawled.
You think that you can just apologize and all will be forgiven? I suffered years of torment at the hands of your little friends, and you almost had me killed. A favor you did your best to return during the war,
Sirius said coolly, and sighed.
No, I don't think an apology is enough to fix everything. I don't think anything is. James saved your life, and you still loathed him.
Snape scowled.
And I don't think we'll ever be friends, or ever like each other, but I'm sick of making an arse out of myself. Lily hated James for years because he made an arse of himself whenever you were around, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let Harry hate me because of the same thing. So Potter's miniature told you to apology. He doesn't even know I'm here,
Sirius snapped. He took a deep breath.
And I intend to keep it that way. I don't want praise for this. This is an apology that shouldn't have had to happen in the first place, because things shouldn't have been allowed to get so far out of hand.
Snape considered him for a long moment.
I'm not kidding,
Sirius said.
Apparently not.
Snape's lip curled.
Dare I ask why this pathetic attempt at reconciliation matters to you? I'm a Death Eater, remember? You don't trust me, and you don't value our non-existent friendship. You got a trial,
Sirius said quietly.
Oh, yes,
Snape said nastily.
So suddenly you care what the Ministry... I don't care what the Ministry thinks,
Sirius said.
But Dumbledore trusts you. And I hate that.
He admitted, with a wry grin.
I hate that he vouched for you, and I hate that you got to walk free after everything you did. But you know what I've realized? Everyone thought I had done something terrible, and that was all it took for Dumbledore to stop trusting me.
His voice was a little bitter, but he couldn't help it.
You, on the other hand,
Sirius continued,
never had his trust. And he vouched for you. He didn't speak up for me, a man he knew and had trusted, but he did for you. And you can call Dumbledore old, or senile, or whatever the hell you want to call him, but he's not stupid. And if he was willing to trust you enough to put his neck on the line by championing you, then whatever you did, or whatever you told him must have been good. I have no idea what you're talking about. Oh, you do,
Sirius said. Snape shifted, looking uncomfortable for the first time.
I'm not telling you,
he said.
I never asked you to.
Snape blinked.
No,
he said slowly. They stared at each other for a long time. They were still rivals. The amount of resentment coming off of Snape was threatening to make Sirius sneeze, but the hatred was gone, or at least absent from this conversation. Snape's scent shifted abruptly, to curious confusion.
So what do you want from this, Black, if not my forgiveness?
The mocking tone was back, but Sirius didn't care.
I want you to know I'm done with this stupid feud, and that I'm sorry. That's it. That's it,
Sirius agreed.
No favors? No expectations? None, whatsoever,
Sirius said, putting his hands up. He waited, half hoping that Snape would attempt to apologize, but he didn't. He still seemed to be trying to adjust to the idea that Sirius didn't have an ulterior motive. Sirius ran a hand through his hair, wondering, yet again, what James would think. Well aware that it would likely be ignored, Sirius offered his hand.
Not enemies,
he said. Snape stared at his hand, as if he had never heard of a handshake before. Sirius shifted, and after almost a minute, cleared his throat and started to lower it. And then Snape shook, very briefly, and with a revolted look on his face, but he shook, and he didn't try to break Sirius' fingers in the process.
Not friends either,
Snape drawled. He released Sirius' hand, wiped his own on his robes and stalked back into his office. The door slammed shut behind him. End of chapter. Chapter 62, Evaluating Options.
Maybe something about a pack,
Harry said, staring up at the ceiling of the library. Sirius, who was flipping through a book on dark magic, more out of habit than out of hope of actually finding anything to destroy the Horcrux, glanced over.
A pack?
He asked. Harry said. He rolled over and scribbled something down onto a piece of parchment that was already covered in words and scratched out sentences that would hopefully form his animagus incantation. James, Lily, and even Remus had always had very neat handwriting. Harry had taken after Sirius with his semi-legible writing.
Like you, me, and Moony. We're all dogs, or wolves, so it's a pack.
Sirius ducked his head so Harry wouldn't see the slightly sappy grin that had spread across his face. Things had been a bit strained was the wrong word, but the best one Sirius could find. Between him and Harry over the past week, after the Snape incident, but Harry still considered him family, if nothing else.
What do you think? I think that sounds like it could work,
he said, trying to sound casual.
Maybe.
Hoot, Remus said, appearing in the doorway. Cradled precariously in his arms were about 50 envelopes.
Posts here,
Sirius told Harry, chuckling.
Is Dumbledore getting you to distribute Hogwarts letters, this year?
Sirius asked.
You've got enough there.
Remus scowled, and threw the pile at Sirius, who managed to catch two, get poked in the eye by one, and missed the others entirely. They fluttered to the floor. Harry crawled over and scraped them into a messy pile, while Sirius swore and muttered rude things about Remus under his breath. Remus glanced up sharply, and looked at Harry, but he didn't seem to have heard. Sirius wasn't looking forward to having to censor himself once Harry had excellent hearing too.
How was lunch?
He asked Remus, who had flopped down onto the couch. A grin, probably not dissimilar to the one Sirius had been wearing a moment ago, appeared for a brief moment, making Sirius roll his eyes. Remus was still oblivious. Harry saw the expression and made a sound like he was smothering a laugh before he promptly buried his face in the carpet. Sirius watched his shoulders shake, but Remus hadn't noticed. He was frowning now.
It was good,
he said,
but I'm concerned.
Sirius waited, and Harry passed him the stack of envelopes, watching Remus curiously all the while.
She's worrying about something. Has been all week, I think, but whatever it is really getting to her. She looked tired. Did you ask her about it?
Sirius asked.
Well, no,
Remus said, shifting. Sirius rolled his eyes again.
So now you're both worrying, her about whatever her problem is, and you about her.
Remus blinked.
You could offer to listen.
He continued.
She's allowed to say no, if she doesn't want to share.
Remus made a non-committal noise, and gestured to the letters in front of Sirius.
Anything interesting?
He asked. Sirius arched an eyebrow to show that no, he hadn't missed Remus' rather obvious attempt to change the topic, but didn't comment. He sifted through the pile, and frowned.
Half of these are for you, he said. I couldn't be bothered sorting them at home,
he said.
Do you want them? Burn them,
Remus told him, making Harry chuckle.
They're probably all hate mail anyway, or petitions, or job offers.
Sirius grimaced. Remus had had 2 job offers, one from a jewelry place in Nocturne Alley that specialized in silver, and one from the Department of Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, asking Remus to join the Werewolf Registry office. Sirius used his wand to cut an envelope open. Gingerly, he extracted a piece of heavily perfumed, pale pink parchment and held it at arm's length.
Dear Sirius,
he read aloud.
I know it's been years since we've corresponded, but your newfound innocence has inspired me to try to renew our connection. I've been thinking about how unfairly you were treated by the Ministry, and, while I can't speak for all of them, I'm of the opinion that you should be compensated. I, personally, was thinking.
Sirius cut off, choking.
Thinking what?
Harry asked, as Sirius cast a hasty incendio and destroyed the letter.
Never you mind,
he muttered, shocked and embarrassed. Remus was having trouble stifling his laughter, and Sirius shot a rude hand gesture in his direction when Harry wasn't looking.
What was in it?
Harry persisted.
I'll tell you when you're older,
Sirius said firmly, choosing a normal, parchment envelope. Harry wrinkled his nose, apparently catching on, and nodded. Sirius cut that one and got a scent of something bitter, which set his instincts on edge at once, but the curse triggered before he could react. There was a cracking sound as the bones in his hands snapped. Sirius swore, tears springing into his eyes, and his wand and the envelope dropped onto the desk.
Finite,
Remus said, almost immediately, but it did nothing, and Sirius' wrists were next. His vision flickered and he heard Remus try another counter-charm. Pressure started to build in his forearms, and he clenched his teeth, preparing for the breaks. Harry shouted something, and light blinded Sirius, but then the feeling in his arms faded. He sagged in his chair, breathing through his teeth. Remus was already crouching beside him, casting charms to dull the pain, and other ones to inspect the damage. Harry vanished with a pop and returned a few seconds later with their post-full moon supplies.
The Skelegro bottle, please, Harry,
Remus said. Sirius groaned. Skelegro was foul stuff, and it itched and ached like mad. Remus conjured a glass and filled it halfway. Then he held it to Sirius' mouth and Sirius reluctantly gulped it down.
Bloody hell,
Sirius gasped, trying to keep the potion down. Remus helped him drink a glass of water after that, thankfully.
It's not that bad,
Remus said.
It's awful,
Sirius choked, and Remus smiled wryly.
And yet you feed it to me monthly,
he said, looking amused.
Only if the break's too tricky to fix with a wand,
Sirius countered, wincing as heat raced through his hands.
And that's not often these days.
Remus smiled and nodded, to concede his loss, and Sirius poked his tongue out.
I don't think that looks right to me,
Remus said pointedly, obviously mock offended by the gesture. He unscrewed the cap of the Skelegro bottle and held it up rather menacingly, poised to pour.
I'd better give you another dose, just in case.
Sirius clamped his mouth shut, and lifted his arms up to fend Remus off, but without the use of his hands, or being able to bend his wrists, he knew he'd lose if Remus actually decided to make him drink. Sirius considered his options and did the only thing he could, put his head down onto the desk, and managed to do so without jolting his healing hands too badly. It had seemed like a clever idea, foolproof even, but he hadn't noticed the pile of ashes that had replaced the cursed envelope and the book Sirius had been reading. A cloud of black billowed up around his head, making him sneeze. Remus and Harry burst out laughing, and Sirius kept his eyes shut tightly, grateful they hadn't been open when his face hit the desk.
Scourgify,
Remus managed, apparently taking pity on him. There was a scrubbing sensation on Sirius' face and then it stopped and he deemed it safe to look up. Harry was sniggering, but Remus had pulled himself together. Sirius rubbed his wrist on his shoulder, very gently, because it was starting to itch.
"Are you all right?"
Sirius wriggled his fingers very carefully. They were rather stiff, but not sore anymore, though he didn't feel brave enough to move his wrists just yet.
"Never better,"
he grumbled. Needless to say, they were far more careful sorting through the letters after that. Sirius refused to let Harry help at all, and sent him to the other side of the room to keep working on his animagus incantation. Harry went rather reluctantly, and didn't work at all. Instead, he rolled his wand between his fingers, and kept an eye on Sirius and Remus. None of the other letters were anywhere near as eventful, however. Someone had sent Remus an envelope filled with some sort of potion, but both he and Sirius smelled it and were able to incinerate it before it could cause any problems. Sirius received a whole stack of fan and hate mail, 3 interview requests, which he promptly destroyed, and an envelope with the DMLE coat of arms on it. The last, he inspected curiously, and cast a few charms on before he deemed it safe enough to open. The parchment that fell out was crinkled, as if the sender had changed their mind and scrunched it up before changing their mind again. Mr. Black, I am writing on the behalf of someone mutually known to the both of us. I know you don't owe either of us anything, but I could really use the help. Yours sincerely, Gawain Roberts. Roberts hadn't used official ministry parchment, nor had he signed with his position and office, he had only used his name. Sirius reread the letter and knew the someone could only be Marlene. His stomach clenched unpleasantly. He hadn't seen her for over a month, not since she had been guarding him and Harry in the ministry holding cells, but things had been understandably tense between them. She hadn't even come to his trial, though he suspected she had something to do with Peter showing up, since her mentor was the one who had brought him into the courtroom. Still, he thought, uneasily. Why does he need my help? After a few moments of thought, permeated only by a headshake at Harry and Remus, who were looking troubled, he reached the conclusion that he knew Marlene better than anyone. Dumbledore, McGonagall, Mad-Eye, or even Roberts himself knew her, of course, but not as well as Sirius. And even Sirius didn't know her as well as he had used to. Who else? Could Roberts ask for help? Sirius wondered. He toyed with Amelia for a moment, but he was fairly sure that Roberts would have tried her before Sirius. Sirius shoved the letter into the pocket of his jeans and stood.
"Padfoot?"
Harry asked, sitting up. Remus was watching him warily. Sirius scratched his aching wrists and then pushed his chair back under the desk.
"I'm going to the park,"
he said.
"Either of you want to come?" "Is Marlene okay?"
Remus asked, sitting down on the bench next to Sirius. Sirius tore his eyes away from number 13, which he had been staring at for the last 10 minutes, and gave Remus a rather guilty look. Then he tossed a piece of parchment at Remus, which Remus read and passed back, his suspicions confirmed.
"Are you going to see him?"
Sirius shrugged.
"I probably shouldn't,"
he said, his eyes now fixed on Harry, who was sitting on a patch of grass, watching something near his trainer-covered feet. Remus thought he was listening to their conversation, his head was tilted too far in their direction for it to be coincidental.
"He's right that you don't owe her anything,"
Remus said, to test Sirius' reaction. As he had expected, Sirius rounded on him, looking furious.
"I know things haven't been friendly between her and me lately,"
he said in a low voice.
"But if she's in trouble..."
He shook his head.
"She's still an old order member, she's still family, and she doesn't have anyone else." "No, probably not,"
Remus agreed calmly.
"I'd do it for anyone, you, obviously, Amelia, Bean, Dung, M." "I know you would,"
Remus said, holding up his hands. Sirius seemed to have expected an argument of some sort, and looked bewildered when none were forthcoming. Sirius glanced at number 13 again, and then quickly away. His eyes landed on a cluster of children on the other side of the park. Most of them were wearing brightly colored hats. Remus assumed it was a birthday gathering of some sort, and were also still wearing their school uniforms.
"We're family,"
Sirius said, his eyes drifting from the laughing children, to Harry, who was sitting quietly, watching the birthday party too.
"If it was Reg, I'd help him, even though we didn't always see eye to eye."
Remus helpfully didn't point out that Regulus was dead, and had been for years.
"Reg never tried to kill you,"
he said quietly, glancing at Harry to make sure he wasn't overheard. Sirius hadn't told Harry the full story, which Remus thought was probably for the best.
"Do you think he's lonely?"
Sirius asked.
Remus
said, thrown.
"Well, I'm sure your parents are with him again, if you believe in that sort of thing, and James and Lily will be watching out for." "Not Reg,"
Sirius said, looking exasperated.
"Harry."
Harry's eyes were still fixed on the kids on the other side of the park. They were singing a cheerful chorus of Happy Birthday, and he was wearing the strangest expression. It was a little curious, but also sad and guilty and embarrassed.
"Oh,"
Remus said.
"You shouldn't have changed the subject so abruptly. If you believe that sort of thing,"
Sirius chuckled.
"Honestly." "Do you?"
Remus asked. Sirius looked surprised, and then, looking a little sheepish, nodded.
"You?"
Remus inclined his head, and they shared an awkward look and then glanced away.
"So?"
Remus said, digging up a chunk of grass with the tip of his shoe.
"Harry?" "Yeah,"
Sirius said, seizing the topic with relief.
"Harry." "And his loneliness,"
Remus agreed.
"Exactly,"
Sirius said, and then sighed.
"He hasn't said anything, but I've wondered. He's got you and Creature, and me,"
Remus said.
"Yeah, a lunatic house elf."
Sirius said this far more fondly than Remus had expected, despite knowing how far Sirius and Creature's relationship had come.
"The world's most irresponsible godfather, who was on the run from the law until very recently, and a werewolf,"
Remus suggested, chuckling.
"I was going to say overly mature, overly studious godmother,"
Sirius said, shrugging. Remus chuckled.
"I mean, we have fun, I know we do, and thanks to Azkaban, I'm really only 23.
He gave Remus a grin that made him look 23, instead of 30.
"But I'm not a kid anymore. I can't be, because Harry needs a guardian more than he needs a sibling." for the moment anyway.
Remus rather thought that Sirius was a bit of both, but was curious about what Sirius had to say, and didn't mention it.
But he needs a friend or something,
Sirius continued.
Someone his own age. I had Reg, growing up. James and I didn't have anyone,
Remus pointed out.
And neither did Pete.
There was a moment of silence after Peter's name. Remus wondered, briefly, how he was coping in Azkaban, and was sure Sirius was doing the same, and then Sirius nodded.
No, you didn't.
Sirius clenched his fists. Remus didn't think it was an angry gesture, but rather one that was to try to stop the ache that Skele-Gro usually left as a parting gift.
And I know for a fact that Jamie was lonely before Hogwarts, and over the holidays. Why do you think he wrote to us all so much? And you can't tell me that you never wanted a friend. Friends were an impossibility for me back then,
Remus said, staring at the partygoers again.
I was too dangerous.
Sirius punched his arm, and then swore and clutched his hand. Remus chuckled before he could stop himself, but his amusement was quickly replaced by concern.
Are you all right? You haven't rebroken anything, have you? Bloody git,
Sirius muttered, inspecting his hand. Remus hid another smile.
And no, I haven't. It's just tender.
Sirius wriggled his fingers and then shook his hands.
A second opinion would be nice, you know,
he muttered, after a moment.
Let's see, then,
Remus said, trying to get a look at Sirius' hands.
For Merlin's sake, Moony,
Sirius said, looking exasperated again, and this time, smacked the side of his head.
Worth it,
he said, before Remus could express any worry about his hands.
An opinion about Harry. I think him being lonely is possible,
Remus said after a moment's thought.
He seemed to enjoy his time with the younger Weasleys when they broke into Amelia's office, and I know he didn't like Hydrus Malfoy, and had mixed opinions about Draco, but I do think he appreciated the company, regardless. That's what I thought too. You've already thought about it?
Remus asked, a little surprised.
Quite a bit,
Sirius admitted.
When we were first living together, he told me he didn't want to go to school, and I agreed, because he didn't want to, but when I thought about it more, I realized it was too risky to let him out of the house, and have him away from me, when we were in hiding. Keeping to ourselves was a necessity, and he never complained, so I let it be. Ever since the trial, though, I've started to wonder. You could always ask, you know,
Remus said.
I know,
Sirius said.
Then why haven't you? Because I don't have a solution to offer yet.
He grimaced.
If he is lonely, then I want to be able to say something other than, thanks for telling me, but bad luck for the time being, kiddo.
The children were now playing chasey. Some had retained their party hats, but the majority were lying in the grass, like bizarre, conical flowers, and squealing on the other side of the park. Remus watched them, and then looked at Sirius.
School, he said. School?
Sirius asked, flatly.
Like those stupid little Hogwarts preparation classes they run in Hogsmeade.
Remus blinked.
They run what? Classes, Sirius said. Where you learn about the subjects and the houses and how to hold your wand properly, which is pretty pointless if you ask me, because pretty much every teacher covers that in the first lesson anyway. They have classes before Hogwarts? Like Wizarding Primary School. Yeah, Sirius said, but they're rubbish, which is why everyone learns from home, or gets a tutor. Did you go? No, Sirius said. My parents hired a tutor when I turned 11.
He smiled and Remus just knew it had ended badly.
What happened? I set her on fire,
Sirius said, grimacing.
It was accidental magic,
he added, hastily.
I didn't mean to, but... well, these things happen.
He shrugged in a sheepish, but not at all remorseful sort of way.
Peter went to the classes?
Remus asked, wondering how he had never known this.
Yep,
Sirius said.
Seemed really proud of it too. He tried to tell me how to hold my wand on the first morning, and he had this stupid little song that went with it, and so James and I sat him down and told him he should never talk about those lessons or anything he had learned from them if he wanted to make it through his first day of real school.
Oh, Remus thought. That's how.
But that's obviously not what you meant, is it?
Sirius asked slowly.
You didn't even know they existed.
Remus shook his head, and Sirius squinted at him.
So what were you talking about? Nymphadora, come here, for a moment, before you go running off,
Mum said. Tonks poked her head into the sitting room. Mum was waving her wand over clothes to iron them. Dad had bought her a Muggle iron for Christmas 2 years ago, and Mum hadn't even tried it, and gestured with her free hand for Tonks to sit down. Tonks did.
Not on the arm of the chair,
Mum said, looking irritated, as she reached for another of Dad's shirts. Tonks slid off the arm of the chair rather ungracefully, and ended up on her back on the seat of the chair.
Better?
She asked. Mum rolled her eyes, but a smile was tugging at her lips.
How's training been?
Mum said, after a moment. Tonks' heart sank.
I've hardly seen you, so it must be busy at the moment.
This was followed by a sideways look.
Pretty busy, yeah,
Tonks said, a little uncomfortably. She couldn't remember the last time she and Mum had had a conversation that extended beyond what was for dinner, or could Tonks please stop apparating into the house?
Exams are coming up. And then holidays. Sort of,
Tonks said.
Only in August, and it's not really a holiday. Normal lectures and things are cancelled, but I'll still have to tag along with Mad Eye on specific cases. I was thinking of going to see Charlie and Tom, though.
That made Mum smile.
How are they? Good, I think,
Tonks said.
They're both still completely useless when it comes to writing, so it's hard to tell, but neither of them have been eaten yet, so I suppose that's good.
Mum laughed and started on a pair of Tonks' robes.
And how are you?
Mum asked.
Me?
Tonks asked.
Fine. Why?
Mum set her wand down and planted her hands on her hips. Tonks felt those grey eyes on the side of her face and reluctantly met them.
What? You've been down, lately,
Mum said.
Quieter. Is it something to do with a boy?
Mum cleared her throat and gave Tonks a significant look.
Or a man, even. What?
Tonks asked, bewildered.
No, it's just some aura stuff that's starting to get to me. It's nothing.
That was a blatant lie. The whole Smokey is Florence thing had been eating a hole in Tonks' conscience for just over a week now, and she had resolved to do something about it today. She just didn't know what.
Are you still enjoying it?
Mum asked.
You know, when you first joined, I worried that you might not be able to. I can handle it,
Tonks snapped, and Mum bristled.
Don't you take that tone with me, Nymphadora Gladys Tonks,
Mum said, lifting her wand in warning.
You're obviously stressed at the moment, but that doesn't mean I'll tolerate you being rude. Don't call me Nymphadora,
Tonks grumbled, feeling guilty.
I'll call you whatever I want to,
Mum said firmly, ironing the creases out of another pair of robes.
So what's this aura stuff that's bothering you? I'm not supposed to talk about it,
she said.
This is me, though. Come on, I'll bet all of your friends know.
Mum said, arching an eyebrow.
Actually they don't,
Tonks said.
Oh,
Mum said, apparently thrown. Tonks thought shock was a fair response. Generally Tonks was reasonably open about her problems, so it meant it was something important if it was being kept a secret.
All right, sweetheart.
Mum said, looking troubled.
I'll leave aura things to you, then, all right.
Tonks smiled, grateful it was Mum she was having this conversation with. She and Dad probably saw eye to eye on more issues than she and Mum did, but Dad would have tired to convince her to open up and ask for help. Mum, as a Slytherin, usually knew when to back off and let other people deal with their own problems.
Sounds good to me,
Tonks said. She whispered her sidekick's passcode and checked the time.
Bugger,
she said, and Mum opened her mouth to tell her off. Tonks slid off the couch and bounced to her feet.
I'd better go, or I'll be late,
she said over the top of Mum's voice. She kissed Mum's cheek.
Love you. Nymphadora.
But Tonk had already turned on the spot. The living room melted around her and became the alley around the corner from the visitor's entrance to the ministry.
All right,
she told herself.
By the time I get to level 2, I will have decided.
She took a deep breath and climbed into the phonebox. Giving herself a deadline seemed to have helped a bit. She wasn't coming in for training, that wasn't until that afternoon, but Florence and Yaxley were studying in one of the lecture theaters, and had extended the offer for Tonks to join them. Mad Eye was in his office, with their list of blue magic-wielding suspects. She could go to him, or she could go to Florence, and she had been distant with both lately, so there'd be questions, she was sure of it. And she'd have to give answers. It was Mad Eye she went to, as had probably been inevitable. He didn't look up when she walked in, but she thought his eye was probably trained on her through the top of his head.
Nymphadora,
he said, and then he did look up.
Sir,
she said nervously. An odd expression settled itself on his face, one that was hopeful and wary all at once.
It's Florence. Florence Pruitt.
She managed, before her nerve broke. Mad Eye gestured for her to sit.
I know,
he said.
You what?
Tonks whispered, glad that she had sat, or her legs might have given way.
I know. Have for a few days. Pruitt's Lovegood's cousin, which is how she knew her and was able to organize the first interview. And Lovegood's a good sort as far as upholding confidentiality, but the way she defended Smokey's identity made me think it was personal. And I was right. Pruitt's on the list, had access to Greyback, as well as motive if she's a werewolf, and because of Clark's death, and she got an O for her transfiguration NEWT, 4th highest score we've ever had, behind Potter, you and Black, so she's capable. Why didn't you tell me? I almost did,
Mad Eye said.
Then I realized that you already knew, and I wanted to see how you would handle it. A test?
She asked weakly.
I haven't slept for days, and I've been worrying and it was a test. Pruitt's involvement isn't,
Mad Eye said, looking grim.
But your response was.
Tonks couldn't even find the energy to be angry.
Did I pass?
She asked.
It's never that easy,
he sighed.
So what do we do?
She asked in a small voice.
We talk to her,
Mad Eye said.
And then we go from there. I'll help,
Tonks said.
I want to know why. You'll find out why,
Mad Eye said grimly.
But you'll do that from the sidelines. I'll be asking the questions. Your wand,
Mad Eye said, holding his hand out. Florence produced her wand slowly and pressed it into his scarred hand. Then she sat down, folded her ankles and clasped her hands in her lap. Tonks closed Mad Eye's office door and cast a few charms to prevent eavesdropping, and also locked it.
I'm not running,
Florence said, glancing at Tonks over her shoulder.
You don't need to lock it. Do you know why you're here?
Mad Eye growled.
I know,
Florence said quietly.
You're accused of Fenrir Greyback's murder,
Mad Eye said. Florence said nothing. Tonks felt like crying, because her silence was as good as a confession. Tonks conjured herself a chair and sat down, hugging her knees to her chest. Mad Eye gave her a look, and she unfolded herself, reluctantly, and earned a small nod.
I don't need to tell you how serious this is, do I? No,
she murmured.
But given the circumstances, I think. Circumstances?
Mad Eye asked.
Give who it was,
Florence said, with a rather flinty look in her eye.
Murder's wrong, no matter the victim,
Mad Eye said.
Have you ever killed anyone, or a moody? I'm not the one answering questions,
Mad Eye said, and it was obvious that he had. Tonks hugged her knees again, and this time, Mad Eye didn't tell her off.
During the war?
Florence asked, and Mad Eye, surprisingly, nodded.
Because you had to? To save someone. In the heat of the moment, because I had no other choice,
Mad Eye said.
You had a choice. He had already killed Melvin,
Florence said.
He's bitten over 100, and killed probably just as many others. It might not be war in the conventional sense, sir, but it's still war. It's high casualties, caused by one git with an inflated sense of self-importance, and it's been drawn out over 20 years instead of 2, but that doesn't make it any less horrible. It doesn't justify killing. You fought in the war,
she said.
If you had had a clear shot at you-know-who, would you honestly have left it, because killing is wrong? Murder's wrong, certainly,
Florence said, over the top of Mad Eye, while Tonks stared between them. It was like watching chasers pass a quaffle back and forward.
So why is the death of one such a big issue? Greyback may have been a murderer, but he was restrained, and not in a position to threaten anybody,
Mad Eye growled, looking a little flustered.
He wasn't dangerous Wasn't dangerous,
Florence said, looking angry.
He's always dangerous. He doesn't need a wand to hurt people.
Tonks remembered the attack on Matt in London, and shuddered.
He was already being punished for his crimes. In Azkaban?
Florence asked, rolling her eyes.
Greyback's not human enough to be affected enough by Dementors for it to have punished him at all. He wouldn't have liked it, obviously, but he'd have been back to his normal, monstrous self within a week of being let out. He might have changed. Azkaban's a prison, not a correctional facility.
Florence snapped.
If you really believe people can change, then why was Sirius Black's escape such a big issue? He spent 7 years there, surely he should have changed if anyone was going to. You know as well as I do that Greyback wouldn't have, he'd have come back with a vengeance. I'm not saying I did the right thing, it's morally questionable, I know that, but I don't think it was the wrong thing, and I certainly think his death's got more positives associated with it than it does negatives.
Mad Eye and Tonks shared a despairing look, and Florence folded her arms, watching them with a steely expression. Hi, everyone. End of chapter. Chapter 63, An Offer of Assistance.
So what exactly are you hoping to accomplish here?
Florence asked, lifting her chin. She had been sitting down for almost an hour, her legs were beginning to cramp, and she had nothing to show for her time. She hadn't been arrested, and she hadn't been freed. All that had happened was that she had had her morality questioned, been told off, and the three of them had grown steadily more frustrated. Tonks looked at Moody like she too wanted answers. Moody glowered at her, but it was a softer look than the one that had previously been directed at Florence.
What you did was wrong. No,
she snapped.
It wasn't. I picked a side. There are no sides. Obviously there are. If you and that monster that called me daughter were on the same side, he wouldn't have been arrested. It's your job not to be on his side.
And not to be on mine, she added silently, pleased that Tonks hadn't spoken up to defend her, or challenged Moody on her behalf. She had worried Tonks might not take her as a serious threat because of how friendly Tonks was with that other wolf, the one who had been in the papers with Black.
We can't just let you go,
Moody said, his blue eye rolling toward her. His dark one stayed fixed on Tonks, whose shoulders had slumped. Florence felt sorry for the poor girl, with Melvin and McKinnon gone, and her own future starting its inevitable downward spiral. Tonks would only have Ben and Salacia. An Aura wasn't an easy occupation to choose, but Florence rather thought their group had had a harder first year than most.
So it's off to Azkaban with me, then?
Florence asked, frowning. Moody was quiet for a long time, and Tonks' breathing almost stopped. Florence could hear her heart racing, and gave her a small, sad smile. Tonks' face crumpled, and she dropped her eyes. Moody sighed and looked between the two of them.
It should be. That would be the fair thing to do. Murder's murder.
Florence bit her tongue to keep from arguing. She had made her arguments before, convincing ones, or at least she had thought so, and didn't see the sense in repeating them.
Shall I pack a bag then?
Florence asked. She could smell his reluctance, whether it was because he knew arresting her wasn't fair, or if it was purely because of Tonks, she didn't know, but she wasn't above playing to that. Moody seemed like the type of man that needed a push in one direction to make him choose the other.
And hand in my letter of resignation.
She watched him carefully, fairly sure that this approach was risk-free. Moody watched back, his expression unhappy.
You should,
he said finally, and Florence's heart skipped a beat. Her arguments had been far too well reasoned for this to be the outcome, and while she had thought about what would happen if she was caught, she had never believed that she'd actually be sent to Azkaban. Tonks had squeezed her eyes closed, and her hands were clamped so tightly around each other that they were white-knuckled and shaking slightly.
Will you enforce that?
Florence asked quietly. Moody barely paused before he answered.
No,
he said, and Florence couldn't help but feel a little smug. She thought, perhaps, that he was hoping her conscience would force her to hand herself in. Good luck with that, she thought sadly. She felt obliged to put herself in a position that best enabled her to serve the wizarding world, but beyond that, she had no conscience. What little of it that had remained after Greyback first attacked her had died with him, though that was probably for the best. If she didn't have a conscience, it couldn't be corrupted. All she had to do was stick to the decisions she had made when she did have one, and she'd be fine. For a while, anyway. She didn't feel like a monster, except on full moons, but she had grown up hearing stories, and she had read enough accounts in books to know that she had turned one day, and hurt someone. She didn't have a choice in the matter. All werewolves were like Greyback, that's what everyone said, and just because she wasn't now, didn't mean that she wouldn't be tomorrow, or next week, or next month. All the books said she was a monster, and that many authors couldn't be wrong. If they were, then why were people so prejudiced, so afraid? It was only a matter of time, and she had already had 2 years. She knew she didn't have long left, but she was going to make her time count, and to do that, she needed her job. She needed to save good people, and lock the bad ones away, and with any luck, she'd be killed capturing a criminal. That way her colleagues wouldn't have to deal with her when she went bad. Her eyes found Tonks, who was staring fixedly at the floor. Florence wondered if she might be better off in Azkaban. Probably. But she wasn't ready yet. Getting rid of Greyback was a good contribution, but there were still others out there. Others that had chosen to be monsters, rather than forced into it. And she wanted them behind bars, or dead, so that by the time she joined them, she was the worst thing out there. She swallowed and looked up at Moody.
So I can go. You can go. Until the end of August,
Moody said. 3 weeks. Florence's jaw set, but she inclined her head and said nothing.
You can sit your exams, and you can finish the year so you don't draw attention to yourself. After that, compulsory lessons finish. You'll still have to deal with Finch, but 1 aura's better than the department. Turn yourself in, run for it. How you handle it is up to you, but if you come back on the 1st of September, I will have you arrested. Am I clear?
Perfectly, Florence said. She knew her chances of getting her wand back were non-existent, so she didn't bother asking for it. She stood and headed for the door, already searching for potential loopholes. Obliviation? She wondered, twisting her mouth. She reached for the handle as Tonks flicked her wand to cancel whatever charms she had put up, and Florence nodded her thanks and pulled the door open. Dawlish and a squat woman in pink who had been involved in the black trial glanced in her direction as they walked past. Florence didn't like the smell of either of them, conniving and hungry in Dawlish's case, and sickly sweet like poison in the woman's, and decided to walk the other way, but Moody cleared his throat loudly before she had taken more than a few steps.
Wait a moment,
he said from the doorway, looking thoughtful. She turned, arching an eyebrow, but Moody was silent for a while, as if weighing his options. Then he glanced over his shoulder.
Nymphadora, will you be our bonder?
Florence stiffened, and caught Moody's scent of grim satisfaction.
All you're going to promise is not to hurt anyone,
he said,
or to erase our memories.
Florence pursed her lips.
I don't think you're the type, but I killed Greyback and can't be trusted,
she said lightly. Moody glanced around, as if she was mad for speaking about it so casually, and Florence cursed herself. The corridor was empty, aside from Dawlish and his companion, but they had vanished around the corner. They had fallen silent, however. Florence frowned, and made a few mental estimations. Tentatively, she decided they hadn't been close enough to have heard. Or so she hoped. She was a bit uncertain about normal human hearing after 2 years with wolf ears. She eyed the corner, but neither reappeared.
Do I have to?
She asked Moody.
Constant vigilance.
Tonk's voice drifted out of the office and was steadier than Florence had expected.
Indeed,
Florence murmured. She stepped back into the office and offered Moody her small hand.
Have this back,
Aura Moody said gruffly.
Thank you for your participation, Pruitt.
There was a pause, and Dolores strained her ears, even though magic was doing the eavesdropping for her. And sweet Salazar, she had heard things she could make use of.
Sorry it's come to this. So am I,
the trainee, Pruitt said, though she didn't sound sorry, just tired.
See you tonight.
Dolores glanced around the corner and saw the girl who had admitted to killing Greyback exit Moody's office. The girl set off toward the misuse of Muggle artifacts office rather slowly, as if her mind was elsewhere. Dolores walked after her. Pruitt turned around almost as soon as she started to move, and her eyes narrowed. She brushed her hair out of her face as spun again, her hand jumping to her pocket. She walked away briskly, but she was shorter than Dolores and not at all difficult to keep pace with.
Hem,
Dolores said, and Pruitt's shoulders stiffened. She jerked around.
Are you lost, madam? No, I'm exactly where I need to be, thank you,
Dolores said, smiling. Pruitt's eyes flicked over the bow in her hair. Dolores adjusted it absently, and folded her arms.
Have you got a moment, dear? What for? The Auras are raising their recruits to be suspicious these days.
Dolores said with a laugh that she hoped reassured the girl.
I won't bite, dear, I just want to talk. My office is free. Who are you?
Pruitt asked, not looking impressed. Dolores' smile withered. Usually, people knew who she was.
I am Dolores Umbridge, from the Department of Management and Control of Magical Children and Junior Undersecretary to the Minister.
Dolores patted Pruitt's arm and gestured toward the lift.
This way, dear.
Dolores suspected Pruitt would have refused if she had been able to find a way to do so politely. She glanced at Moody's office and then sighed and shuffled after Dolores, who was itching to tell the girl to pick up her feet when she walked. She refrained. Shortly after, they had settled in Dolores' office and Dolores had set up several privacy wards, because no one could know about their meeting. Pruitt eyed the kittens on the walls and curled her lip.
I would have picked you as a cat person,
Dolores said, arching an eyebrow. She tapped her teapot to get the water inside to boil.
Tea.
Pruitt shook her head, and Dolores barely managed not to roll her eyes. She'd expect someone with a name as prestigious as Pruitt to display basic manners. She reached for the sugar pot.
So you don't like cats? I don't hate them,
Pruitt offered. She frowned.
Did you really bring me here to talk about cats? Dogs, actually. One in particular.
Pruitt pursed her lips.
Greyback. He's an acquaintance of yours, I believe. In a sense. You killed him,
Dolores whispered, adding her fourth spoonful of sugar. The office was quiet, except for the sound of the teaspoon on the side of the teacup. Pruitt seemed to be struggling for words.
I heard you confess to Moody, and I heard the vow you made.
Pruitt pinched her nose and made a soft, annoyed sound.
And I'd like to help you.
Pruitt blinked and glanced up through her fringe.
Help?
She asked, sounding confused and hopeful. Dolores smiled at her and patted her hand.
Yes, dear. Help?
Dolores leaned back and took a sip of tea.
I can make your problems go away. How?
Pruitt asked, frowning.
I have very good connections. The minister would be moved by your plight, I'm sure.
And Cornelius had managed to follow her advice, as well as Mr. Malfoy's, these past few months, to resecure his position. It had been a delicate situation, but he had come out well at the end of it. He had power again, though perhaps not quite as much as when he was first elected.
moved by my plight?"
Pruitt asked.
"You've done the wizarding world a service, by destroying that awful beast,"
Dolores said kindly.
"The Aurors aren't allowed to think so, of course, but we in other departments aren't so blinded. You should be rewarded, not punished." "I shouldn't be punished,"
Pruitt said.
"But I don't deserve a reward either. It should just stay neutral."
Dolores took a moment to process that, and then smiled, satisfied. The girl had simple needs, and was self-sacrificing, as was typical for most Aurors. She'd be easy to work with. Dawlish seemed to be the selfish exception.
"But it's not neutral, is it?"
Pruitt didn't say anything.
"And that's why I'd like to help you. You can keep me in the program." "Tricky business, that, but yes, I think I can."
Very tricky, considering she'd be acting alone in this particular situation. That way, Pruitt would be entirely in her debt, and far more malleable than if they shared a lust for power, the way she did with Mr. Malfoy and Dawlish. Pruitt would be her little puppet, feeding her inside information from the DMLE, which was difficult to penetrate, and having her own personal informant would reduce her need to rely on Dawlish at all. Frankly, Dawlish was infuriating, and now, it seemed, he was replaceable. And, it would force Mr. Malfoy to rely on her, instead of her relying on him. Dolores felt her smile widen.
"How?" "I'll need access to Moody's suspect list,"
Dolores said.
"Easy enough to get, I think."
There were spells, there was plain old sneaking, there was always sending someone, an Imperius on Moody's trainee, or going in under Polyjuice, or even interrogating the trainee were all possibilities.
"Then, I simply pay someone to confess everything. You can give them the details they'd need, we think of a suitable motive, and they do some time in Azkaban."
Pruitt looked ill.
"It won't be long,"
Dolores assured her.
"They'll get a trial, and the Wizengamot is forgiving in special cases like this one. And when they're freed, they'll have a large sum of money waiting for them. Moody might still know the truth, but he won't argue, not when the evidence is so conclusive."
Dolores smiled encouragingly.
"You won't force anyone to take the fall for me, will you?" "Of course not, dear. I'll make the offer, and they'll be free to accept it or turn it down. I'm very diplomatic. I want to meet the person before they agree to anything. I know one of the suspects, and she can't be allowed to do it."
"Of course," Dolores said, taking another sip of tea. Pruitt was silent, apparently thinking things over.
"Why are you helping me?"
she asked finally.
"I need help too,"
Dolores admitted, putting her teacup down. Pruitt arched an eyebrow.
"I work for the minister, and the minister serves the ministry. And the ministry's been rather segregated since Black's trial. We're trying to achieve interdepartmental unity, but your department, the Auro department, is resisting that. Scrimgeour seems to be running things on his own." "Scrimgeour's a good department head." "I never said he wasn't, dear, only that he's becoming too independent. We're starting to worry that he's trying to break free of the ministry altogether."
Pruitt frowned thoughtfully.
"And that his judgment is becoming obscured by his newly elevated status. We, that is, the minister and I, want to repair things before they become a serious problem." "That doesn't have anything to do with me,"
Pruitt pointed out.
"Not directly,"
Dolores said.
"But you've got an inside perspective that neither the minister or I could hope to achieve. You know the dynamics of the department, dear, and you know who really runs things, and what their political opinions are." "I'm just a trainee." "You're in a position that's easy to overlook, which makes you all the more valuable,"
Dolores corrected.
"We could use your opinions on the way certain events play out, and your warnings if Scrimgar does ever attempt to separate himself from the ministry, or worse, if he ever chooses to try to overthrow us. You want me to keep you updated on happenings in the department,
Pruitt said,
in return for arranging for me to stay in the program. I think it's quite reasonable. So do I,
Pruitt said. Dolores hid her smile in her tea. Florence left Umbridge's office feeling like she needed a shower. The woman absolutely reeked of flowery perfume, and sugar, and nastiness. Umbridge's offer to keep Florence in the program was all she had to work with at the moment, and, while it wasn't foolproof, it secured more loose ends than anything else she had managed to think of yet, which wasn't much. As for what Umbridge wanted in return, well, Florence wasn't happy about that side of things. She couldn't believe the woman's gall. What sort of meddling cow tried to blackmail someone into spying on the Auror department? Oh, Florence would accept her conditions, she'd do whatever she had to keep her job, but Umbridge wasn't going to get anything useful from her, that was for sure.
You came,
Roberts said, looking stunned. Sirius shoved his hands into his pockets and leaned against the side of the cubicle.
Eventually,
Sirius murmured. It was mid-July, almost 2 weeks since he had received Robert's letter asking for his help, and he had finally decided to come in and have a meeting with the man. He had decided that he wanted to help almost straight away, but then he had forced himself to think about things properly before he committed himself to it. He had realized that agreeing to help Marlene would probably mean spending a lot of time with her, and he had realized that that would mean forgiving her. He had thought he'd be able to manage that. There were a lot of unresolved issues between them, caused by faults, or perceived faults, on both sides, so it wouldn't be easy, but Sirius thought or hoped it would be possible. He had tried to visit her at number 13 several times, but she had always been out. 2 days ago, he had broken in a fit of immaturity, and been disturbed to find the house seemingly abandoned inside. While he had already decided to help, that had been the event that prompted his visit to Roberts.
You came,
Roberts said again, shaking his head.
That's good enough for me.
Sirius nodded, a little taken aback by his sincerity.
So what's wrong with her?
He asked warily. Roberts sighed and gestured for him to sit down. Sirius did, taking a very simple, very uncomfortable wooden chair, while Roberts pulled a piece of parchment and a wand out of his desk drawer.
Your letter was pretty vague. And her house is empty.
Roberts looked up sharply, and then shook his head slightly and passed Sirius a piece of worn parchment. Gawain, it said. I'm sure by now, Sirius is a free man, and well on his way to settling back into the wizarding world. With any luck, it will be an easy transition. No thanks to me. I'm sure, if you had the chance to speak to me, you would try to talk me out of this, but while I've listened to you in the past, I refuse to even hear your opinion on this matter. What I've done is unforgivable, literally, and I need to atone for that. The box contains my house key, and my vault key. Sell my house, and everything in it. I've taken my most prized possessions with me, and add the earnings from that to my vault. Contact Sirius and tell him that he and Harry are entitled to as much money as they need. It cannot begin to compensate for what I've done, but it's a start. Give the rest to St. Mungo's. Do what you want with my wand. I won't be needing it anymore. I'm sorry. Marlene. Sirius leaned back in his chair and rubbed his chin. He read the letter again, and then dragged a breath in between his teeth and shook his head. What have you done, Marles? He wondered. I'll agree that you've made a few mistakes, but what sort of atonement could you possibly be hoping to achieve that couldn't be managed with an apology? It occurred to him that she was now as scared of him as he had once been of her, scared of judgment, of not being forgiven, of being attacked in retaliation. Sirius felt sick.
When?
He said, and was embarrassed to hear that he was croaking. He cleared his throat, but Gawain didn't seem to have judged him from it.
When was this written? May,
Roberts said, folding his hands, and setting them on his desk.
May.
Sirius repeated, weakly.
So it's been, what, 2 months? She just picked up and vanished 2 months ago, without her wand, and no one's seen or heard from her since. Black, sit down,
Roberts sighed. Sirius looked down and saw that he was indeed standing, and that the letter was crumpled in his fist. Embarrassed, he sat and passed it back.
Your summary of the situation is accurate. I've tried everything. I've tried to think of her and apparate, I've been to Sears and asked them to scry her for me, I've apparated to all of the popular wizarding and muggle locations in London and searched on foot, and with spells, but I can't find her.
Roberts looked ill by the time he had stopped speaking, and his eyes were shadowed.
I've run out of ideas, and it's not helping that I'm so emotionally attached to the situation. And I won't be. You're a fresh pair of eyes,
Roberts said helplessly.
You know her, and you're no stranger to vanishing off the face of the earth yourself.
Sirius shrugged awkwardly.
I need a lead, need something to work with. And you think I can give you that?
Sirius asked carefully. Merlin, Marles, 2 months. He closed his eyes briefly.
I'll try anything at this point.
Sirius looked at Roberts and was well able to believe that. Sirius was quiet for a moment, thinking things over.
And I can be flexible, I'll work around your commitments, and I'll pay you. You don't have to pay me,
Sirius said at once. Even after that ridiculous fine for not registering Padfoot, he probably had enough money to comfortably support himself, Harry and Remus for the rest of their lives.
And I'll provide you with anything you might need. This, for starters.
Roberts passed Sirius a heavy golden object that looked a bit like a pocket watch. Sirius returned Marlene's letter to Roberts, in exchange.
It's McKinnon's, but given the circumstances. What is it?
Sirius asked, rattling it.
A secure communication and identification device with coordinate clock. A sidekick?
Roberts smiled, and pulled out his own, which was a little more tarnished than the one Sirius held.
Courage, virtue, determination, and intelligence,
he said, and both folded open. Inside was incredibly complex, but Roberts gave him a quick lesson on how to use it, and changed the name on the front to read Sirius Black, and Sirius thought he'd manage.
And that symbol?
Roberts tapped small owl that was engraved on the inside of the device, alongside almost 20 other symbols. Sirius saw a lynx, an eye, 2 small birds, one was a robin, the other a finch, a bear, 2 runes he didn't recognize and a mermaid amongst other things.
Is a direct link between this device and my own. Some auras have phrases, or passwords, all you have to do to reach me is say my name. Your full name, or title, or Roberts,
Roberts said.
Nice and simple. That's how they used to work, by names, and then Mad Eye Moody thought it might be a security risk, so he campaigned to make passwords available.
Sirius smiled to himself.
What inspired these?
He asked, shaking Marlene's sidekick.
Mirrors,
Roberts told him, pulling out a piece of parchment and a quill. Sirius grinned, a little sadly, and added that to his list of things to tell James tonight, before he went to bed. Sirius was sure that James, wherever he was, would appreciate the news, though it was possible he already knew.
So, when are you able to help?
Sirius frowned, counting days in his head.
I'll take an hour a week if that's all you can give me. A different hour every week if you're not able to be consistent.
Roberts, Sirius realized, was desperate.
I can do a few hours on Wednesday and Saturday afternoons,
Sirius said. It had taken them the better part of 2 weeks, but he and Remus had finally talked Harry into attending Muggle school, come September. Remus had done some research, Matt and Dora had both attended Muggle primary schools, and was trying to catch Harry up on the year and a half of schooling he had missed when he and Sirius were in hiding. Sirius generally found other things to do while Harry and Remus were working on that, the same way Remus usually went and occupied himself elsewhere when Sirius was helping Harry with his Animagus project. Hopefully, come September, the gaps in Harry's Muggle education would only be small, and he could focus on the socialization aspect of things, which was the point of the idea of sending him to school in the first place. Making friends was also the part that Harry was most scared about, thanks to his cousin, and Sirius was eternally grateful that Harry had met the Weasleys and Draco Malfoy and had mostly positive experiences, or convincing him that yes, he was capable of making friends would have been downright impossible.
Wednesday and Saturdays.
Roberts wrote that down.
Except for the 31st,
Sirius said.
I won't be working on that day. I can give you time off if you need it,
Roberts said at once. Sirius smiled.
Those 2 afternoons are all I can do for now.
Roberts nodded, not seeming at all disappointed.
But come September, Harry'll start school, and that'll free up my weekdays. I'll take what I can get,
Roberts said fervently, making a note of that.
You don't understand how much this means, how much I need the help. I'll get a second desk, it'll only be small, but there's not room for anything bigger, I'm afraid, and put it in the corner, there. Consider this cubicle yours whenever you need it. That sidekick'll get you access to the Ministry Library, should you need anything from there, or anything in the Department of Magical Records. It gives you a lot of authority.
For the first time, Roberts looked a bit like his old, stern self, and Sirius felt the urge to fidget. The shape was wrong, but his eyes were green enough to remind him of Lily's, and her stares had always been terrifying.
It should go without saying that if you abuse that authority, I'll have to confiscate that sidekick, and it'll make finding McKinnon a lot harder. I'll behave,
Sirius assured him. Roberts gave him a thoughtful, slightly wary look that made Sirius wonder what stories he had heard about Sirius school days, or even about Sirius early days in the program. Thankfully, though, he either hadn't heard the worst of it, or whatever he was seeing when he looked at Sirius now was enough to override that. Sirius privately thought it was the latter.
Thank you,
Roberts said.
For behaving, and for agreeing to help.
Roberts stood and held out his hand, which Sirius shook.
I know after everything that happened, agreeing to help me help her can't have been easy. It was a lot easier than you would think,
Sirius said quietly. Roberts gave him a long look and then smiled sadly and nodded. This time, Sirius did fidget.
So, tell me what you know. She's wandless,
Roberts said, holding up a slender wand that Sirius knew almost as well as his own.
And the last spell she cast with this was a permanent transfiguration on her hair, to turn it blonde.
Sirius wrinkled his nose.
She's homeless, I've set up wards specific to her to let me know if she ever goes home, and I've been up to the Bureau of Wizarding Family History to get her family tree and gone to meet everyone that's a third cousin or closer that's still alive to see if they've seen or heard anything, but they're as clueless as I am. I've talked to Mad Eye and Dumbledore and the trainees to compile a list of her friends, or people she might go to for help, but not me or Remus. Remus is in league with you, and guilt over you is why she's vanished in the first place.
Point taken, Sirius said, feeling queasy.
It isn't your fault,
Roberts said quietly. Sirius smiled wryly. It sort of is, he thought, but didn't say anything. Robert's eyes flicked over his face.
Last I saw her, McKinnon wasn't stable, and I don't think that any decisions she's made are based on sound thought processes. It's entirely emotional. And that's supposed to make me feel better. It's supposed to give you an idea of what we're dealing with.
Sirius sighed and waved a hand to tell Roberts to continue.
She's also broke. She hasn't touched her Gringotts account since the day she left to guard Potter at Malfoy Manor, and that was only a few galleons. I've also been through all of the alerts for use of magic around Muggles. If she had somehow got her hands on another wand, or used accidental or even wandless magic. Wandless. Trainees get special lessons in a chosen talent,
Roberts said, a little impatiently.
All they really do in first year is submit an application, try to find a teacher and do some background reading, but it's possible she's managed to pick something up. Or even use accidental magic, she's probably volatile enough at the moment. And nothing. Only a handful of users fitting her description out of the hundreds we've caught, but none of them had the right magical signature. She hasn't used magic for months. Or she's behind strong wards,
Sirius said.
There are places that mask that sort of thing. There aren't many places with that kind of magic up, and McKinnon doesn't have access to them, unless she's sleeping under a rubbish bin in Diagon Alley. St. Mungo's?
Sirius asked.
Checked every ward. So she's alone, wandless.
Sirius wouldn't say defenseless, because Marlene had a rather impressive punch. She had broken a Death Eater's nose in Sirius' 7th year.
Homeless and has no money.
Roberts nodded.
I'd say she's in the Muggle world. If she's not using magic, there's got to be a good reason for it, and that's the only one I can think of. And she'd need to be living with someone, because there's no way she'd be able to fend for herself.
When they had shared his flat during the war, they had relied on simple meals, which was all Sirius had been capable of making, and on other Order members, namely Lily and Bean, and on eating out, or in the kitchens at Hogwarts. Marlene must have learned to cook at least passably while she was living alone, but she'd have had magic the entire time. She'd fare no better in the Muggle world than Sirius would. And doesn't that just fill me with confidence, he thought miserably. What have you done, Marley? End of chapter. Chapter 64, Dora and the Dictionary. The rest of July passed quickly after Sirius' meeting with Gawain. The majority of his time was still spent with Harry, whether they were working on Harry's slow-going Animagus incantation, or flying at Remus, or playing games of chess and exploding Snap. Then, on Wednesdays and Saturdays, he'd leave for the ministry just after lunch, and return in time for dinner. After his first few days, he had returned home with a headache and sore throat. He and Roberts did a lot of talking, and a lot of reading and brainstorming to try to work out where in the Muggle world Marlene might have hidden herself. He was also usually exasperated by all the stares. He'd have thought the novelty of seeing him walk around level 2 might have worn off after the first few times, but no such luck. It really did seem that the people of Wizarding Britain had nothing better to do than gawk at Sirius wherever he went. Had it happened during his school years, he'd probably have loved all the attention. Though back then, he'd probably have done something to earn it, some prank with one of the other marauders, or an impressive performance in Quidditch. All he had done to earn their current scrutiny, was be a victim of the Ministry's rather significant blunder, and associated himself with Harry. Neither of those were things he particularly approved of being given celebrity status for, and as such, he rather wished everyone'd find themselves something else to stare at. Despite all the hassle of coming into the Ministry, however, Sirius would be lying if he said he wasn't enjoying it. It was nice to get out of the house and go somewhere other than Remus, Walpole's, or the park across from Grimmauld. And it was nice to feel like he was doing something. He hadn't realized how much he had missed having a job until he had one again. He liked the challenge of trying to solve puzzles, he liked the feeling that he was helping someone, even though he was yet to find Marlene and so wasn't really helping her directly yet. He was certainly helping Roberts, and he liked the fact that about a week after he started, he had the brainwave that perhaps she had admitted herself to a Muggle hospital, which meant that he and Roberts were out and about asking questions and looking for clues, rather than stuck inside. He also liked the fact that, while they hadn't made much progress, it felt like they were already narrowing down their options, and that it was only a matter of time before they found her. That feeling of accomplishment was something Sirius was greatly looking forward to, after being denied it with that stupid locket for so long.
"There are still a few we haven't checked,"
Roberts said, one afternoon in late July. He was sitting at his desk and Sirius was leaning over his shoulder. Both were looking at an enormous map of Muggle London and the red crosses which showed which hospitals they had visited.
"I can do that one tomorrow, if you would like,"
Sirius said, tapping the map.
"You don't work tomorrow,"
Roberts said, twisting around in his chair to raise an eyebrow at Sirius. Sirius shrugged.
"I'm heading that way anyway. Besides, I'm not coming in on Saturday, because it's the 31st,
Roberts said, nodding. He turned back to the map.
"I know. I'll try to cover what's left of the hospitals before next week. If I don't find anything, we can talk on Wednesday about our next move, and if I do, you'll send me a letter,"
Sirius said. He had installed a Muggle letterbox on number 12's front fence. It had no number on it, just a painted paw print that he, Harry and Remus had had far too much fun administering one sunny afternoon last week. Because the owls needed to know the secret to be able to find either Sirius or Harry inside the boundary of the Fidelius charm, they had set up an external drop-off point. All letters addressed to Padfoot's place would find their way to him, though so far, Roberts and Dumbledore were the only people he had told about it, and Roberts was the only one who had used it.
"Or call me through the sidekick. That IWI. Watcher, RO.
Sirius and Roberts both glanced up to see a green-haired Dora and a Talish boy standing in front of them, looking sheepish.
"Sorry, we didn't mean to."
Roberts glanced at Sirius, who waved and cleared the desk. The boy was looking curiously at the map, and deposited everything in the filing cabinet in the corner. He rather wished he could climb into the drawer too. He recognized the boy now. It was the trainee from the night with the Dementors down in the holding cell, and the last time he had seen Dora had been after the full moon, when she had wanted to speak to Remus. He didn't know how his presence would be received this time, and was a little afraid to find out.
"No news, I'm afraid, but we're looking,"
Roberts said, gesturing for them to come in. Sirius backed away a bit. The cubicle was relatively small, and seemed even smaller with 4 people crammed inside.
"We?"
the trainee asked, his eyes landing on Sirius at once. Dora looked surprised as well, which surprised Sirius in turn. Remus hadn't told her? She got a thoughtful look on her face a moment later, however, and then nodded, as if it made perfect sense. Sirius supposed it probably did.
How long for?
Dora asked.
As long as it takes,
Sirius replied. She held his gaze for a moment longer, and then beamed. She took a step forward, and for a moment, Sirius thought she might run up and hug him. Then her hair turned a pale pink, as did her cheeks, and she stepped back into line with the other trainee.
Do you need us to go?
The other trainee said,
or? Nah, I'm heading off anyway,
Sirius said, and Roberts nodded.
See you next week,
he said, giving Roberts a little wave. Then he smiled and nodded at Dora and the trainee and slipped out past them. He saw Bones and Scrimgeour talking outside an office on the way to the lift and stopped very briefly to say hello to the pair of them, before he continued on to the lift. He pressed the button and had just rocked back on his heels to wait when he heard footsteps. He glanced over his shoulder to see Dora, who was alone now, making her way over. She looked a little nervous, but also hopeful.
"Watch her,"
she said lightly, pressing the button for the lift.
"Hi,"
Sirius said. He was about to put his hands in his pocket, but he caught himself and passed the movement off as patting his pocket for his wand.
"Are you?
He had no idea what to say, so he gestured to the lift.
"Headed to the atrium,"
Dora replied cheerfully.
"You too, right?"
"Right," Sirius said, shifting. He wanted to talk to her, he just had absolutely no idea what to say. They were family, and he knew her pretty well through Remus, and through his own, though admittedly, outdated, experiences, but those things weren't helping at the moment. After a slightly awkward pause, he cleared his throat, and she looked up hopefully. He wondered if she was just as lost for words as he was.
"How are you finding the program?"
She looked relieved and Sirius grinned.
"It's brilliant,"
she said happily. The lift arrived and they stepped into it. Two other men, a tall, balding redhead and an older, white-haired one, hurried on just before the doors closed.
"Watch her, Arthur,"
she said, and smiled at the other wizard. Both greeted her with smiles and let her press the button for the atrium. The old wizard stared at Sirius rather unabashedly, but the younger one, Arthur, just smiled at Sirius and then started flipping through a stack of papers in his hands.
"A bit full on at times,"
Dora said, startling Sirius.
"But that's to be expected. Mostly."
She looked worried for a moment and then shook her head as if to dismiss the thought.
"Things happen,"
Sirius agreed.
Hopefully things settle after the break,"
she said, though she didn't look comforted by that thought.
"Remus mentioned you had exams last week,"
Sirius said. Dora's eyes turned a warm brown at the mention of Remus, and Sirius wondered if she realized. He tried not to smile and failed miserably.
"My last one was on Monday,"
she said.
"And, what's funny?"
"Nothing," Sirius said. Dora pursed her lips, and looked uncannily like McGonagall when she did so. Sirius noted that even her nostrils were flaring.
"Merlin, that's scary,"
he said. Arthur chuckled quietly in the corner, and Dora looked rather pleased with herself, but also a little suspicious. After a moment, she let the matter drop.
"So how long have you been helping Roberts?"
she asked.
"Nearly 2 weeks,"
he said.
"So you're worried too?"
she asked heavily.
"I guess so,"
he sighed.
"And you really don't have anything?" "A few guesses,"
Sirius said, rubbing his chin.
"Nothing solid, which is a pain in the atrium,"
the lift's cool voice announced. Arthur was laughing as he and the old wizard stepped out. Dora had a hand over her mouth and her shoulders were shaking.
"But we're looking,"
Sirius said, leading the way out of the lift,
"and the more places we search and don't find her brings us that much closer to the one she's at."
He shrugged helplessly, and Dora nodded. They stood in silence for a moment.
"I suppose I'll see you around,"
he said, gesturing to the fireplace. She had already started to move toward her own fireplace.
"I'll keep an eye out,"
she said, beaming, and Sirius smiled back in response. Dora gave him a funny look, and then bit her lip. He gave her a moment to say anything she wanted to, but when she remained silent, grabbed a handful of flu powder. He was just about to throw it into the flames when a hand grabbed his wrist to stop him.
"Wait,"
she said.
"Have you had dinner yet?"
No," Sirius said, blinking.
"That's where I..." "Did you want to grab a bite?"
she asked.
"We're getting into the habit of seeing each other, having an awkward conversation and then leaving and then repeating the whole thing the next time we run into each other."
Sirius had to admit she was making a very good point. He stepped away from the fireplace to let others use it, and dropped the flu powder back into its pot.
"We just need to sit down and talk until it's not awkward anymore,"
she said.
"Excellent plan,"
he laughed.
"Just let me tell the others that I'll be home later."
He dwindled off, and pulled his mirror out.
"Harry Potter,"
he said, while Dora looked on curiously. The image in the mirror swam and then focused on the ceiling of one of the rooms at home.
"Harry,"
he said.
"Moony."
He waited and then called again, but no one responded. Dora looked confused.
"Are they okay?"
she asked, as he shoved his mirror back into his pocket.
"Probably in the kitchen,"
Sirius said, as a witch with curly hair shoved past him, stopped when she realized who he was and started to stammer apologies.
"It's fine,"
he said, rolling his eyes. She apologized once more, and then hurried off to a fireplace, looking mortified.
"They obviously don't have it with them, and Moony's hearing's good, but it's not that good,"
he told Dora, who was waiting patiently. He grimaced.
"And that means they'll worry if I'm not home in the next half an hour."
Her face fell, but she nodded and said,
"You should go, then. Maybe some other titanium." "Do you have anywhere you need to be?"
Sirius asked, cutting her off. She shook her head, and he gave her a thoughtful look. She was probably trustworthy, she had managed to keep Remus' secrets for the better part of a year, and she was family. There was no reason, now that they knew that he was innocent, that he couldn't reach out to her and Andy and Ted again. He smiled to himself. And, if Remus finally got his act together and asked her out, which really should have happened months ago, then he'd want to spend more time with her, and that either meant that he'd spend less time with Sirius and Harry at Grimmauld, or that Dora would have to come with him.
"No,"
she said warily.
"Your mum won't worry. She knows how unpredictable the program can be, even when it's supposed to be the holidays,"
Dora assured him.
"Would you like to come to dinner?"
Sirius asked.
"Harry'll be there, and Moony." "Like, you mean, at your house?"
she asked, wide-eyed.
"At my house, yes,"
Sirius said patiently. Her mouth hung open for almost a minute while she apparently tried to decide how to respond to that.
"Are you sure it's okay? I don't want to, I mean, where you live is, well, you've been very private." "Only because I don't want people to show up unannounced,"
he said. Dora blushed.
"Then maybe this isn't a good idea,"
she said.
"What do you mean?"
he asked, frowning.
Well,
she said, and her hair turned a playful peachy color.
Once I know where someone's house is, I have this terrible habit of inviting myself over all the time. Just ask Remus.
Sirius laughed, and so did Dora, but she looked nervous.
Are you really sure that? Come on,
Sirius said. Dora smiled nervously and headed toward the fireplace. Sirius shook his head, well aware that he'd probably end up making a fool of himself if he tried to tell her their flu address. He was bound by the secret, and so mentioning Grimmauld Place in any context that involved him or Harry would result in him being tongue-tied, like Remus had been with Dumbledore. Sirius had got a lot of enjoyment out of that story, but didn't really want to repeat.
We'll have to apparate. Do you have anything against side-along?
Sirius anticipated Dora's stumble upon landing, and so was able to catch her. She thanked him, blushing, and then glanced around, probably trying to get her bearings. It didn't take long. Her eyes locked onto number 13, and then widened.
You live near McKinnon?
She asked.
Neighbors,
he replied. He started toward number 12, and heard her following. He felt bad for seeming a bit abrupt, but he wasn't sure how much he could say without being caught by the charm. So, he said nothing else. He saw her eyeing off the letterbox, and the snake on the door.
Here?
She asked. Sirius smiled and stepped past her toward the door, making her jump.
Sirius!
She called, worriedly. She glanced around and pulled out her wand. Sirius stared at her, but her eyes never landed on him. It took Sirius a moment to realize what had happened.
Guess we know it works,
he muttered, and she didn't even blink. She was still glancing between the front door and the street.
Sirius?
She asked again, and he stepped off the top step, and out of the Fidelius charm's protection. She shrieked and he had to duck as a pink jinx whizzed past his ear.
Sorry.
She gasped.
Sorry, you were just startled. How?
Sirius laughed, and inspected the small dent her spell had made in the wall behind him.
I forgot about the top step,
he said apologetically.
I think it's best if you wait here, I'll get Harry and he can let you in.
Get, she said, and then trailed off as Sirius disappeared to her eyes again. He tapped the front door with his wand, she didn't appear to notice that either, and stepped into the lit hallway. The floorboard creaked as he closed the front door. Dora didn't notice that either, though she was squinting at the house rather intently.
Hello.
Sirius called, and he heard Remus call a greeting in reply.
I need a hand with something.
There was a pause, they were obviously sharing a look, or one of them had said something, and then he heard chairs scrape and then footsteps. Harry appeared at the top of the kitchen stairs, followed only a few seconds later by Remus. They both looked curious.
Can you get the door, Moony?
Sirius didn't really fancy being hexed, or risking Harry. Remus, on the other hand, wasn't protected by the charm and so would be perfectly visible. Remus gave Sirius an odd look, but strode over and pulled the door open without voicing anything. Then he froze. Sirius couldn't see his face, but he was willing to bet there was a silly grin on it.
Is that Dora?
Harry asked. He sounded reasonably sure, but she did always look slightly different, so his question was a valid one.
That's her,
Sirius agreed, ruffling Harry's hair. Dora spotted Remus, beamed and bounced forward to give him a hug. She looked past him, into the house, but her eyes slid right over Sirius and Harry.
Just let her know we're coming out,
Sirius said to Remus, who nodded and relayed the message.
So no hexes,
Sirius added, guiding Harry forward.
No hexes,
Remus said, and Dora looked sheepish. Harry went first. Sirius noticed Remus brushed her arm just before he came into sight, so that she wouldn't be startled, and then Sirius followed.
"This is bizarre,"
she said, shaking her head at them.
"Fidelius charm,"
Remus told her. Harry took her arm and led her inside, the way he had with Snape early last year. She followed him, tripping over the doorway as she went, though thankfully she didn't fall, and Sirius and Remus exchanged a look and followed them inside.
"So what are you doing here?"
Remus asked, as Sirius shut the door. Dora was looking around with interest.
"Well,"
Sirius said, with a grin,
"she asked me out to dinner."
Remus' expression changed a little, though Sirius was having trouble reading it.
"And I suggested we eat here instead." "I see,"
Remus said, pursing his lips, and it was then that Sirius was able to place his expression and scent, jealousy, and perhaps a bit of irritation. Sirius' grin widened.
"We're always so awkward,"
Sirius said, grimacing.
"Dinner seemed like a good way to get comfortable with each other."
Dora nodded absently, and Remus huffed, glancing between them. Harry was hovering awkwardly by the bottom of the stairs, apparently not sure what to make of the situation.
"Merlin, this place is fancy,"
Dora said, noticing the chandelier.
"Would you like a tour?"
Sirius asked, giving her his most charming smile. Harry's eyes widened slightly, and he slipped away, headed upstairs. There was no doubt in Sirius' mind that he was probably going to try to shove everything under his bed, or into his wardrobe before they reached the upper level.
"I'll show her around, if you would like,"
Remus said, in a voice that was probably meant to be casual. Dora cocked her head at him, and Sirius raised an eyebrow.
"You've been working all afternoon. You should probably sit down." "I'm fine, Moony, honestly,"
Sirius said. He put an arm around Dora's shoulders. He felt awkward for doing so, but he also knew it would annoy the hell out of Remus, and gestured into the study.
"This is..." "And,"
Remus interrupted,
"you haven't spent any time with Harry all afternoon."
Sirius realized he had crossed a line and was close to making Remus angry. He released Dora.
"He knows my weakness,"
he said, grinning at her.
"Just makes sure you show her where all the bathrooms are, remote."
With that, he transformed into Padfoot and bolted up the stairs.
"Wicked!"
he heard Dora exclaim, and heard Remus groan. Harry, surprisingly, was not in his bedroom. He was in the library, filling one of the desk drawers with bits of parchment, and several books. Padfoot turned back into Sirius and leaned against the doorway.
"Animagus stuff,"
Harry said, without prompting, once he noticed Sirius.
"She's an Auror, and... I mean, you got fined, so I thought..."
"Smart," Sirius said, and Harry shrugged as if it was nothing. Sirius saw the pleased little grin he was wearing before he turned away, however.
"Here I was thinking you had gone to tidy your room."
Harry looked at him in a way that made Sirius think he was worried for his sanity. Then he smiled crookedly.
"I suppose that's a hint, isn't it?"
Sirius raised an eyebrow, and Harry gave him a sheepish look.
"I'll do it on the full moon,"
he said, and Sirius believed him. Harry tended to get bored while he and Remus were away, and did all sorts of odd jobs that he wouldn't usually bother with.
"Deal. How was work? Did you..." "Nope,"
Sirius sighed, stepping into the room. Harry asked the same question every time. He could be unnervingly persistent at times, and so Sirius didn't even have to wait for him to finish before he answered. One day soon, he was hoping that he'd be able to answer yes. He flopped onto the couch while Harry hid the last of the books, and then sat down in the armchair opposite him.
"How'd lessons go this afternoon?" Fine,
Harry said, shrugging.
We're just about at the end of Matt's year 4 work. Mooney thinks we'll be able to start year 5 stuff in August. Is it interesting? I suppose,
Harry said, not sounding overly enthused about it all. There was a pause and then he wrinkled his nose and added,
I really don't like geography. What do you like?
Sirius asked, hiding a smile. From the look on his face, Harry didn't like any of the subjects all that much.
Maths is okay,
Harry offered finally, and then,
magic is better. You say that,
Sirius said, amused,
because you've not yet had the pleasure of one of Professor Bin's lectures on the Goblin W.A. Padfoot,
Remus called from somewhere below them.
Creature says dinner's ready.
Harry and Sirius shared a glance and jumped up. Remus and Dora had already settled themselves in the kitchen. Sirius was amused to see that Remus had taken the seat beside Dora's at the table. Harry didn't even seem to have noticed, and sat down, conveniently enough, opposite Remus, which left Sirius opposite Dora. He grinned and sat down. Remus looked a little smug for a moment, at least until Sirius said,
Excellent. What is?
Remus asked, accepting a bread roll from Creature.
I'm the last person to sit down,
Sirius said, smiling pleasantly,
and yet I've got the best seat at the table, directly across from our lovely guest.
Remus didn't speak to him for the rest of the meal. Harry's 10th birthday fell on a Saturday, and, while Sirius insisted he was more than welcome, Remus opted not to head over to Grimmauld until lunchtime, so that Sirius and Harry could have some time together. He had expected them to have a large breakfast, courtesy of Creature, spend time unwrapping presents, and probably end up attacking each other with the masses of wrapping paper, and then play with the presents, or spend time planning some sort of prank with which to get Remus with upon his arrival. He had not expected, even in his wildest imaginings, to walk down into the kitchen and find Sirius and Harry sitting at the kitchen table, with Severus Snape and Draco Malfoy. 3, 4, when Remus spotted Creature, of them were wearing gaudy party hats, though Sirius was the only one who didn't seem to mind his. Creature looked indifferent, but Remus rather suspected he had been forbidden to take it off. Harry was tugging at his while he alternated between talking to Draco and sending wary glances at Sirius and Snape. Draco was holding his head very still, and kept reaching for the hat, only to check the movement and drop his hands back into his lap. His pale eyes were fixed rather intently on Sirius. Snape's hat rested in a crumpled heap by his elbow, and his expression was sour, though that may just have been because he was talking to Sirius.
Mooney,
Sirius said, spotting him. He flicked his wand and Remus felt a slight weight settle itself on his head. He reached up to confirm that he was indeed wearing a hat like the rest of them.
Had a good morning.
Remus nodded, stunned, and managed to stammer a happy birthday at Harry, who accepted it with a smile. Remus patted his pocket, to tell him they'd do presents later, and then gave Remus a confused sort of shrug, as if he had no idea how whatever this was had happened either.
Lupin,
Snape drawled.
Snape,
Remus said, blinking. Sirius waved him over, and Remus staggered in their general direction and sat down between Sirius and Harry. Draco gave him a thoughtful look and then smiled. Remus waved at him, before looking over at Sirius in askance. Sirius missed the look entirely, however, because he was talking to Snape. Talking. Not yelling. Not insulting. Talking. His tone was a little strained, and a bit too polite to be considered normal, but they were talking. And Snape looked like he was undergoing an unpleasant ordeal, and his tone was clipped, but he was talking back.
Sound like anything I've ever heard of before,
Snape was saying.
Well, no,
Sirius replied.
I don't expect it would, I invented it. You?
Snape asked doubtfully.
I've heard of, I've made potions in my own mind, potions which affect my mental state, a calming draught, for instance, but spells. It was complicated,
Sirius said.
Obviously not, if someone with no former occlumency experience was able to manage it in a few mere months,
Snape said. There was no bite behind it, just a bit of impatience, which astonished Remus.
I was working on it full-time,
Sirius said.
But most of it was just building off of methods that had already been established. It was only making a wand and casting spells that I really came up. Do you have notes?
Snape asked. Sirius blinked, and Remus could tell from his scent how surprised he was by that particular question.
Yeah, loads.
Sirius blinked again, as if he couldn't believe he was having this conversation.
They're upstairs. Might I be able to read them?
It looked like it was killing Snape to ask that. Remus' insides clenched. At any moment, Sirius was going to laugh and say something about not letting Snape get his greasy hands on his hard work. And things would go downhill from their end.
Yeah, sure. It sort of goes without saying to not let them fall into the wrong hands. And not to let anyone else read. Do I look like an idiot, Black?
Snape drawled.
A bit,
Sirius said.
I mean, you're the only one not wearing a party H. You are a fool,
Snape said, rolling his eyes.
Obviously not, or you wouldn't want my notes,
Sirius shot back. There was a pause, and then Sirius lifted an eyebrow. Snape opened his mouth, looking irate, but then closed it again and said nothing. Sirius grinned, but quickly hid the expression behind his glass of juice, and for the briefest moment, Remus would have sworn that Snape's scowl vanished.
Is something wrong?
Draco asked the side of Potter's head.
You're supposed to look at people when they're talking to you. You've been looking over there too,
Potter said, arching an eyebrow. Draco felt the color rise in his cheeks. He had asked Mother about the white sheep a few weeks ago. She had told him 2 stories, one about her sister, not Aunt Bella, the other one, Andromeda, and also about Sirius Black, the man sitting not 3 feet from him now. And, while Draco was hardly about to run away with a muggle born like Andromeda, he was now a little afraid that one day, he and his family would clash like Black had clashed with his family. He had a good reason to stare.
Have not,
Draco said weakly.
Is it Moony?
Potter asked, and something rather defensive crept into his tone.
The werewolf?
Draco asked, eyeing Lupin, who looked completely confused.
No.
Potter gave him a rather wary look. Draco thought he was expecting a self-righteous declaration of how werewolves were inferior. The only werewolf Draco had ever met was Lupin, however, and he seemed all right, even if Father didn't like him. Draco would never admit it, but he suspected Potter was probably a better judge of character than Father. Or he was at least more open-minded.
So what is it you're staring at?
Potter asked. Draco hesitated. Had anyone else asked, anyone but Severus, or perhaps Mother, he'd have lied. He was a good liar, now, or at least he thought so. When he and Severus played those strange games, Severus often struggled to distinguish between lies and truths. Severus didn't realize how useful that had become at home, and during dinner parties. He probably just thought it was a strange game. To Draco, though, the skill had become something invaluable, and he wanted to find some way to thank Severus. Without necessarily tipping him off, he doubted Severus would approve if he knew. Draco glanced at Potter again, Potter, who had given him the most valuable piece of advice anyone had ever given him, except possibly Severus, when he had scarred Draco's palm. Potter had told him to stay quiet about his beliefs, particularly around father, and Potter was the one who had told him about the sheep in the first place.
Sheep,
Draco said. Potter glanced at the adults, looking completely bewildered. He straightened his party hat absently, and then looked back at Draco.
What, the sheep?
He asked.
Yes, Potter,
Draco said, rolling his eyes. Draco liked Potter most of the time, but he was ridiculously daft.
The sheep? The white sheep, from that story. Oh,
Potter said, his eyes widening.
So you asked about it, then?
Draco nodded curtly.
It was good advice,
he said quietly.
Thanks.
Potter fiddled with his hat once more, and then yanked it off and tossed it down, like Severus had done. Relieved, Draco did the same, since he was no longer in danger of being rude. Potter had done it first, and it was his birthday, so he should be able to make the rules. Draco nodded again, a little awkwardly.
So why are you staring?
He asked.
Padfoot and Snape don't get along,
Potter said, his eyes drifting away from Draco again.
They seem to be doing fine,
Draco commented. They both looked a little tense, but neither seemed too hostile.
I know,
Potter said, looking unnerved. He blinked and turned back to Draco, who only saw the movement out of the corner of his eye. He was back to watching Black, who was scowling at Lupin. Severus looked amused.
Potter,
Draco said.
Malfoy,
Potter said.
Does Black, is he lonely?
Draco clasped his hands in his lap.
Not lonely, I don't think,
Potter said, after a moment.
WH. Does he miss his family?
Draco blurted.
His blood family, or his real one?
Potter asked, pushing his glasses up. There's no difference, Draco thought, exasperated, and decided that Potter was an idiot.
Never mind,
he said dismissively. Potter frowned, perhaps he didn't like Draco's tone, but let the matter drop. It got a little awkward after that, but Draco didn't really care. Things were always awkward for him. Lately, even around his family, he had taken to avoiding father as much as possible, just in case father decided Draco had become too strange and told him to leave, and so, when they were around each other, they were distant enough that it was more like talking to Mr. Greengrass, or Mr. Parkinson than it was like talking to father. Hydrus had, until about a month ago, been firmly on Draco's side whenever he said something without thinking at dinner parties. At home, they were still as antagonistic as ever. After Nadia's birthday, at the beginning of July, however, Hydrus had changed his mind, and apparently decided that Draco was no longer worth defending. Draco had been more surprised and hurt by the loss of his brother's public support than he probably should have been. He should have seen it coming. It was the Slytherin thing to do, but for some reason, he had expected Hydrus to take his side, even if it was the losing one. Draco had been even more startled to realize he thought that way because that was what he would have done. The others had followed Hydrus' lead in the matter. Pansy was the friend he missed the most, and as a result, he was now spending the majority of their gatherings with Theodore and Catherine, and occasionally Vivian, who seemed caught in the middle of an ongoing feud between her sisters. Draco hoped that his and Theodore's tentative camaraderie lasted until Hogwarts. He'd be very lonely in Slytherin otherwise. Then there was Mother. He still felt awful for making her cry on the night of his birthday dinner. He had tried to fix it. Honestly, he had. He had tried to copy Hydrus and his father, but he found himself disagreeing with them, not that he ever voiced it, of course, and the scar on his palm was too strong of a reminder. So he found himself stepping and speaking carefully around Mother too. He was still closer to her than Father or Hydrus, they still hugged, and she still told him stories, but he was being careful not to upset her. She wasn't a bad mother, the fault was all his, and he didn't want to give her any evidence that made her think so. Yes, things had been very awkward whenever Draco was involved.
Thanks for the present,
Potter said finally, gesturing to the dictionary that lay on a small pile of gleaming silver wrapping paper.
I told you I'd buy you one,
Draco said, loftily. He had had no idea how to get it to Potter, but then he had mentioned it in passing to Severus, who had got an odd look on his face and said something about testing a truce. Draco hadn't entirely believed him until they had found themselves on a Muggle street and Potter and Black had quite literally appeared out of nowhere. They had all stared at each other, and then Black had, very awkwardly, invited them inside.
Fun as it is to try to interpret your us and ERMs, it's rather tiresome. If you think I'm bad, you should hear Mooney after,
Potter trailed off, looking wary.
After?
Draco prompted.
The full moon,
Potter said, with an odd expression. His eyes were fixed on Draco rather intently.
He can hardly talk.
Draco arched an eyebrow.
If Lupin's able to form semi-coherent sounds after a night of no sleep, and 2 transformations, Potter, then I haven't even the faintest clue what your excuse is.
Potter opened his mouth and seemed, unsurprisingly, lost for words.
Merlin, Potter, as if I needed any more evidence to support my point.
Potter burst out laughing, and Draco felt a smile, no, it felt different, a grin spread across his face in response. Merlin, I have changed, he thought. Malfoys don't grin. As if on cue, the adults looked over, and Draco hastily smoothed his expression. Black looked curious, Lupin looked even more confused than he had before, and Severus looked a little sad. End of chapter.